She dropped the bread pan. It hit the floor with a sound that rang through the whole kitchen like a gunshot, and every man seated at that long table went dead quiet. Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the counter and stared at the bread. Her bread, the bread she had been working on since 4 in the morning, lying in the dirt, and she did not move for a full 10 seconds. Then she picked it up. She dusted it off. And she put it back in the oven like nothing had happened at all. That was Clara Whitmore. That had always been Clara Whitmore. If you are watching this story and you feel like life has passed you by, like you have been overlooked, underestimated, or told that you are not enough, then this story is for you. Please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, because this one is going to hit somewhere deep, and drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Wyoming Territory, 1886. The train platform at Millhaven was loud with the noise of arrival steam hissing boots scraping against woodmen calling to one another across the crowd. But the moment Clara Whitmore stepped down from the last car, that noise seemed to arrange itself around her in a particular way. Not the way crowds part for someone beautiful. The way crowds stiffen when something unexpected appears. She was 25 years old. She carried one suitcase, dark brown leather, that had been repaired so many times the original color had nearly disappeared under the patchwork of stitching. Her dress was faded, the kind of brown that had once been something richer, something with more dignity in its color. And Clara herself. Clara was a big woman. Not in the way some women are described as having presence, though she had that too. She was heavy in the way that people noticed first and remembered cruelly. Her face was round, her arms were full, and her body moved with the kind of steadiness that comes from a lifetime of being watched and deciding to keep moving anyway. She had learned a long time ago that people's eyes would find her before their manners did. She did not look at the crowd. She looked for one specific man. Nathaniel Carter was not difficult to find. He was standing at the far end of the platform, and everything about him communicated that he was accustomed to people coming to him rather than the other way around. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with threads of silver at his temples that suggested a man who had been weathered by years of real work rather than just the appearance of it. He wore a good hat and clean boots, which in Wyoming in 1886 told you more about a man's character than any letter of introduction ever could. He was also looking at Clara with an expression she had seen on a great many faces. Not cruelty. Not yet. Just the very precise recalibration of expectations. She had seen it at every door she had ever knocked on. She had seen it in the eyes of schoolteachers and church deacons and town merchants and every other man who had ever needed to adjust the picture in his head to account for the reality of Clara Whitmore standing in front of him. She walked toward him without rushing. She stopped a reasonable distance away, set her suitcase down beside her, and looked him directly in the eye. His gaze moved over her. Once she felt it. She always felt it, and then returned to her face, where he held it with the effort of a man trying to be decent. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was even, neutral. The voice of a man who had learned to give nothing away. "I want to say something before we go any further," she said. "So there's no confusion between us later." He waited. Clara did not look away from him. She had learned that too, that looking away first was the thing that cost you more than you could afford. "I ain't pretty," she said quietly. "I reckon you can see that plain enough already. I ain't what most men picture when they think about a wife." She paused just long enough to let that sit. "But I can cook like you have never tasted in your life, Mr. Carter. I can run a household and keep books and manage the kind of problems that don't announce themselves ahead of time. I work before the sun comes up, and I don't stop until the work is done. And I have never in my life broken a promise." She picked up her suitcase again. "So, if you're willing to give this an honest try, I'm willing to give you everything I've got. But if you've already made up your mind based on what you're looking at right now, I'd rather know it here than find out 6 weeks from now." Nathaniel Carter looked at her for a long moment. "My wagon's out front," he said finally. It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch." She nodded once and followed him. That was how it began. Neither of them spoke much on that ride. The land opened up around them in the way that Wyoming land does, vast and indifferent, the kind of country that makes a person feel very small and very alive at the same time. Clara watched it and felt something loosen in her chest. She had grown up in Ohio, in a town where everyone knew everyone, and everyone had already decided what they thought of her. Out here, the land didn't know her name. It didn't know what she looked like. It just stretched on in every direction, with the same cold, magnificent indifference it had for everything else. She found that comforting in a way she hadn't expected. "You have children," she said. It wasn't a question. She had read his letter so many times she had memorized it. "2," he said. "Thomas is 9. Eliza is 6. Their mother. 4 years ago." His jaw moved. "Fever." Clara did not offer anything sentimental. She had found that people in grief didn't usually want sentiment from strangers. "I'll do right by them," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "I know you said that in your letter. I'm saying it again so you hear it from my mouth rather than from paper." He turned his eyes back to the road. "All right," he said. That was, she would realize later, the most significant thing Nathaniel Carter said to her in those first 2 hours. Not because of what the words were, but because of what they weren't. They weren't dismissal. They weren't pity. They weren't the particular kind of gentleness that men use when they've already decided a woman is less than what they needed, and they're just working out how to be kind about it. He said all right, and he meant it as a beginning. Carter Ranch was larger than she had imagined. The main house was solid and well built, the kind of structure that had been put together by a man who intended to stay. But it was clear from the moment she stepped through the front door that no one had tended it with any real care in a long time. The furniture was good furniture, buried under neglect. The kitchen was salvageable, but barely. The whole house had the particular feel of a place that had given up hoping for warmth and settled for being useful. Thomas was waiting in the front hall when they came in. He was 9 years old and had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, which Clara could tell from the set of his jaw before he said a single word. He looked at her with the direct assessing gaze that children often have before they learn to hide their opinions behind manners. "You're not what I thought you'd look like," he said. "Thomas." Nathaniel's voice carried a warning. "It's all right," Clara said. She set her suitcase down and crouched slightly to be more at his level, though given her size, this required some effort, and she did it anyway. "What did you think I'd look like?" Thomas considered this with the seriousness of a boy who respected honest questions. "Pretty," he said. "Like the women in the books Mama used to read." "I see." Clara nodded slowly. "Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you on that count. I can tell you that I know how to make bear claws, and I have never in my life burned a pie crust if that's worth anything to you." Thomas stared at her. "Bear claws?" "The pastry, not the actual." She stopped. "You knew that." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah," he said. "I knew that." From somewhere upstairs came the sound of small feet, and then a 6-year-old appeared at the top of the stairs with the kind of absolute certainty that only very young children and very old women ever seem to carry. Eliza Carter had her mother's coloring and her father's bearing, and she came down the stairs one step at a time, with her hand trailing the railing, looking at Clara the entire way. "Are you the lady who's going to make it not so quiet?" Eliza asked. Clara felt something pull at the center of her chest. "That's the plan," she said. "Okay," Eliza said, and walked past her toward the kitchen as if the matter had been settled to everyone's satisfaction. Clara stood and found Nathaniel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "She doesn't usually talk to strangers," he said. "I reckon she doesn't see me as a stranger," Clara said. She picked up her suitcase. "If it's all the same to you, I'd like to get started on supper." What she found in that kitchen when she truly looked at it was a map of years of barely getting by. The cast iron was good. Whoever had chosen it originally had known what she was doing, but it hadn't been properly seasoned in a long time. The flour was nearly gone. The lard was old. The preserves that lined the single shelf were down to 4 jars. The bread box held the remains of something that had been edible 3 days ago and was now well past its purpose. She looked at all of it. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She made do with what was there, which was a skill she had developed over 25 years of life, in circumstances that rarely gave her what she would have chosen. She made a soup that was better than it had any right to be, with the ingredients available, and biscuits that rose the way biscuits are supposed to rise, and she sweetened the last jar of preserves with a little water and heat, until it became something you could pour rather than scrape. The ranch hands came in for supper at 6 o'clock. There were 14 of them, and they filed in with the resigned, practical energy of men who ate because they had to, rather than because they expected any pleasure from it. They looked at Clara in the way that men who have been without a woman's presence for a long time sometimes look at one, not unkindly, but cautiously, like something in the house had shifted, and they weren't certain yet whether that was good or bad. "Evening, ma'am," said the oldest one, a man with a beard that had gone fully silver, and hands that looked like they'd been carved from old wood. His name, she would learn, was Hector. "Evening," she said. "Sit down before it gets cold." They sat. She served. And then a thing happened that she would remember for the rest of her life. The first man to taste the soup, a young ranch hand with red hair, and the nervous energy of someone who had grown up hungry, stopped with his spoon halfway back to the bowl and looked up at her with an expression that was almost something like disbelief. "Ma'am," he said. "Yes, this is real good." It was not an elaborate compliment. It was the kind of compliment that gets made when a person's body responds to something before their manners have time to dress it up in better words. "Thank you," she said. "Eat up." Nathaniel sat at the head of the table and watched his men eat. She saw him watching. She did not let it distract her from moving around the table, refilling bowls, asking names. By the end of supper, she knew all 14 of them, not just their names, but the small details they let slip when they were tired and fed, and their guard came down a little. The red-haired young man was named Danny, and he sent money to his mother in Kansas every month. Hector had a daughter in Cheyenne he hadn't seen in 2 years and tried not to talk about. A quiet man named Rufus ate everything on his plate twice and never once looked directly at her, which told her something about how he'd been raised. She tucked all of it away. After supper, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children were in bed, Nathaniel found her washing dishes and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" he asked. "My grandmother," she said without stopping. She was the kind of woman who believed that feeding people was the closest thing to prayer that a practical person could manage. Nathaniel turned his hat around in his hands once. "Those men haven't eaten a meal like that in a long time." "I could tell." A silence settled between them, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but hadn't yet found its shape. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "Clara," she said. He stopped. "Clara," he said, like he was trying the word. "I want to be straight with you about something." She turned around and looked at him. "I didn't enter this arrangement expecting much," he said. "I needed someone to manage the house and the children. That was all I was thinking about." He paused. "I want you to know that I plan to treat you with respect. What you'll have here is a fair situation. That's what I can promise." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I have spent my whole life being offered fair. Fair is what people give you when they don't think you deserve better." She kept her voice even, not hard, just honest. "I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I'm just telling you that I didn't come all this way for fair." She turned back to the dishes. He stood there for another few seconds, and she heard something in the silence that she couldn't name yet. Then he put his hat back on his head and walked out. But before he got to the door, he stopped, and she heard him say quietly, almost to himself, "No, I don't reckon you did." He left. Clara stood in that kitchen in the wreck of a house she had agreed to save with her hands still in the wash water, and she looked out the small window above the sink at the Wyoming dark. She thought about everything she had walked away from. The town in Ohio, where the women smiled at her, the way you smile at something you feel sorry for. The years of hearing the particular silence that falls when you walk into a room and people decide in the space of a breath that you are not what they were hoping to see. The mother who had loved her, but spent most of that love apologizing on Clara's behalf, as if being Clara's mother was a thing that required constant explanation. She had gotten on a train and come to a territory that didn't know her name, and she was going to make something out of that. The next morning she was awake before the sun came up. She had found flour in the cellar the night before, a full barrel of it overlooked somehow buried behind other supplies. She had found eggs that the ranch's 3 remaining hens had left in the straw, with the reliability that hens have even when everything else has gone sideways. She had found a jar of honey pushed to the very back of the highest shelf, almost as if someone had hidden it there for a day when they needed to believe sweetness still existed. She made rolls, not biscuits this time. Rolls soft golden brushed with honey and butter while they were still hot from the oven, so the whole kitchen filled with a smell that had no business in a house that had been as cold and empty as this one. Thomas appeared at the kitchen doorway at 6 in the morning and stopped dead when the smell hit him. "What is that?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a statement of wonder. "Breakfast," Clara said. He came in and sat at the kitchen table without being invited, which told her something important about him. "Papa doesn't usually come down for breakfast," he said. "He just has coffee." "That's fine," Clara said. "The rolls will still be here if he changes his mind." He changed his mind. Nathaniel Carter came down the stairs at 6:15, looking like a man who had tried to talk himself out of something and failed. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the same way Thomas had, and for just a moment, one unguarded moment, his face did something she hadn't seen it do yet. It softened. "Sit down, Mr. Carter," she said. "Coffee's hot." He sat. Eliza came in at 6:30 and climbed into her chair and looked at the roll on her plate with the seriousness of someone conducting an inspection. "It's got honey," she said. "It does." Clara agreed. Eliza took a bite. She closed her eyes. She opened them and looked at Clara with an expression that was so plainly and completely unguarded that Clara had to look away for a second, because it had hit her somewhere she hadn't been ready to be hit. "Mama used to make rolls on Sundays," Eliza said quietly. The kitchen went very still. Clara let the stillness be what it was. She didn't rush to fill it or fix it or push past it. She just let it sit there with them the way grief sits, whether you make room for it or not. "They were good rolls?" she asked gently. "The best," Eliza said. "Then on Sundays," Clara said, "we'll make the best rolls." Nathaniel's jaw worked. He picked up his coffee and held it with both hands and looked out the window, and Clara didn't look at him, because a man who is fighting something he wasn't prepared to feel deserves to fight it without an audience. But she heard him exhale long and slow, and she thought this house has been holding its breath for 4 years. It was starting to breathe again. By the end of the first week, the rhythm of Carter Ranch had changed in ways that were small but registered everywhere. The hands came to meals with something different in their posture, not the slumped, resigned shuffle of men eating because the alternative was going hungry, but something with a little more straightness in it, a little more anticipation. Hector had started telling stories at the supper table again, stories about cattle drives and border crossings that had the younger men leaning in without realizing they were doing it. Danny had stopped eating so fast, like he was no longer worried the food might disappear before he finished it. And then there was the afternoon that Rufus, the quiet man who never looked directly at her, stopped her in the yard between the main house and the bunkhouse. He turned his hat in his hands 3 times before he spoke. "Ma'am," he said to the ground. "Rufus," she said. "I wanted to say." He stopped. He tried again. "My right hand. Got a bad cut last week from the wire fence. I've been trying to keep it wrapped, but I ain't good at the wrapping part, and it keeps coming loose." Clara looked at his hand. Even from where she was standing, she could see the wrapping he'd done was half-hearted at best, and the wound underneath it needed tending. "Come to the kitchen," she said, "and I'll sort it out." He looked up at her. Then finally, for the first time, just briefly, just enough, and she saw that what she had mistaken for indifference was actually a very specific kind of shyness. The kind that came from growing up in places where asking for help was something that cost you something important. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She cleaned and wrapped his hand properly, and did not make him feel small for needing it. He thanked her twice. The second time he said it, he was halfway out the door, and he said it more quietly than the first time, like it was meant just for himself. That evening, Nathaniel watched from across the yard as she came back inside. He didn't say anything, but he watched. Trouble arrived on a Wednesday, the way trouble often does not, on a dramatic day. Not on a day when anyone is ready for it, but on an ordinary day when the sky was flat and gray, and a wagon pulled up to the front gate bearing a woman who stepped down from it like she owned not just the wagon, but the ground it was standing on. Victoria Hale was 30 years old and had been the most beautiful woman in Millhaven for as long as anyone could remember, which in her case had come to mean something closer to the most powerful. She had dark hair and a sharp face, and the kind of posture that a certain kind of woman develops when she has never once in her life doubted that a room would rearrange itself around her. She had been expecting to marry Nathaniel Carter. She had been expecting it, in fact, for the better part of 2 years, in the particular way that a woman expects something that has never been promised to her, but that she has decided is simply a matter of time. Clara was in the kitchen when Victoria walked in without knocking. She didn't announce herself. She didn't wait at the door. She walked into the front hallway and then followed the smell of something cooking until she arrived in the kitchen doorway and stood there looking at Clara with an expression that was not quite contempt. Contempt would have required acknowledgement, and Victoria's first instinct was not to acknowledge. "You must be the woman from the agency," Victoria said. Clara set down the wooden spoon she was holding. She turned around. She took her time about it. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "And you are?" Something moved across Victoria's face. People did not usually ask Victoria Hale who she was. "Victoria," she said. "Victoria Hale. My family has known Nathaniel Carter for a long time." She let her eyes travel over Clara in the slow, deliberate way of someone who is conducting an audit. "I heard he'd sent away for someone." "News travels fast," Clara said pleasantly. "It does out here." Victoria folded her hands together in front of her. "I imagine this must be very different from what you're used to." "I imagine most places are different from what you're used to, too," Clara said. "That's usually how different places work." A pause. Something sharpened in Victoria's eyes. "I came to see Nathaniel," she said. "He's out with the cattle," Clara said. "He'll be back around 4. You're welcome to wait in the front room." She turned back to the stove. "I can bring you something." "That won't be necessary," Victoria said. "Suit yourself," Clara said. She heard Victoria move through the house. She heard her open the front parlor door. She heard very clearly the deliberate silence that followed the kind of silence that a woman makes when she is deciding something. Clara stirred the pot. She kept her breathing even. She had met Victoria Hale before. Not this particular woman she had never seen before in her life. But she had met the type. The type that looked at Clara and calculated quickly and precisely all the ways in which Clara did not measure up to what the world had told them to expect from a woman. The type that had already decided she didn't belong. The difference this time was that here in this kitchen in this house that she had already started to bring back to life, Clara was not a visitor. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. When Nathaniel came back at 4 o'clock, she heard Victoria's voice in the front hall change its quality, entirely softening and brightening in the particular way of someone who has put on a performance and is ready for the audience they actually came to see. She heard Nathaniel's voice in response, more careful than surprised, the voice of a man who had expected this visit eventually. She stayed in the kitchen. She didn't need to hear it. She already knew what was being said, the way you know a storm is coming, not from the sky, but from the pressure in the air. But what she hadn't expected was for Nathaniel to come find her after. He came into the kitchen and leaned against the doorframe, the way he had started to do, not quite all the way in, not quite staying out, and looked at her for a moment. "She say anything to you?" he asked. "She said she came to see you," Clara said, which was true. "She say anything else?" "She implied things," Clara said. "The way people do." She glanced at him. "I've heard worse." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to make things difficult for you in town." "People have been making things difficult for me my whole life, Mr. Carter," Clara said. "I'm still standing." She set a bowl on the table in front of where he usually sat. "Eat your supper." He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. And then he pulled out the chair and sat down. "You don't rattle easy," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "I don't." She didn't tell him the other part, the part where every unkind word Victoria had implied had landed anyway, had found its way into the quiet place inside her where all the other unkind words lived, had settled there with the rest of them. She didn't tell him because it wasn't his weight to carry. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But that night, after the house went quiet, and the fire had burned down to coals, and she was sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, while she wasn't paying attention, Clara Whitmore allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything she was carrying. The long years in Ohio. The mirror she had stopped looking into because it told her things she already knew and didn't need repeated. The mother who had tried her best and couldn't quite hide that trying her best sometimes felt like bracing herself. The men who had seen her and looked past her in the same motion. All of it. She let it sit on her chest for a little while, and then she got up, washed out her cup, banked the coals so the kitchen would be warm in the morning, and went to bed. Because tomorrow there were rolls to make, and a house to bring back to life. And she was not finished yet, not even close. The morning after Victoria Hale's visit, Clara woke up before 4 o'clock, not because she had set herself to wake. Not because anything had startled her. She woke up because her mind had been working through the night on something she hadn't given it permission to work on. And when her eyes opened in the dark of the small room off the kitchen that Nathaniel had given her, the first thing she felt was a very familiar, very old sensation. The sensation of knowing that someone had decided she was a problem to be solved. She lay still for a moment and let that feeling be what it was. Then she got up. She built the fire back up in the kitchen stove and set the coffee on and stood at the window while the sky outside began its slow conversation with the coming day. She thought about Victoria Hale's eyes moving over her in that particular way. She thought about the tone of voice, not cruel exactly, but something more sophisticated than cruelty. Something that required more skill and left less evidence. The kind of dismissal that a woman like Victoria had been practicing since she was old enough to understand that she was the kind of woman the world rewarded, which meant she had also been practicing from the very same age. How to treat the kind of woman the world did not. Clara had met that look 1,000 times. What she had never quite gotten used to was how much it still landed. She was rolling out dough when she heard the first sound from upstairs. Then footsteps. Small, quick, the unmistakable pattern of a 6-year-old who had decided that morning had started whether or not the sun agreed. Eliza appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair loose and her feet bare and an expression of absolute determination. "I woke up," she announced. "I can see that," Clara said. "You want to help?" Eliza was across the kitchen in 4 steps. She climbed onto the stool that Clara had already started thinking of as Eliza's stool, the one she'd moved from the corner without planning to, without even really noticing she'd done it, until one morning Thomas pointed it out. "What are we making?" Eliza asked. "Cinnamon bread," Clara said. "Your papa's going to ride into Millhaven today for supplies, and I want him to have a good breakfast before he goes." Eliza accepted this information with the gravity of someone being briefed on an important mission. "He doesn't like going to town," she said. "No. He says town is where people go to say things they should keep to themselves." Clara almost smiled. "Your papa's a wise man. He says you're different from what he expected. Eliza said with the complete and terrifying honesty of a child who has not yet learned to edit herself. Clara kept rolling the dough. Is that so? I heard him telling Hector. He said you didn't. Eliza's brow furrowed, searching for the word. He said you didn't flinch. The rolling pin paused for just a breath. Flinch at what? Clara asked. I don't know, Eliza said. But Hector said good. He said a woman who doesn't flinch is worth 10 women who do. She picked up a small piece of dough and turned it in her fingers. I think you're worth more than 10, she added with the kind of uncomplicated certainty that only exists in children and sometimes in very old people who have stopped caring about what sounds reasonable. Clara set the rolling pin down. She looked at this small girl on the stool, with her bare feet and her loose hair and her enormous unguarded heart, and she felt something shift in her chest so significantly that she had to breathe through it. That might be the nicest thing anybody's said to me in a long time, she said. Eliza shrugged. I'm going to say nicer things when I think of them, she said, and reached for more dough. Nathaniel came down at 6, same as he had every morning that week, and Clara realized she had already started tracking his footsteps on the stairs, the way you track weather, not obsessively, just as a matter of practical orientation. He sat. She poured coffee. He looked at the cinnamon bread and then at her. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. He ate half the loaf, Ed. When he stood to go, he picked up his hat from the hook by the door and held it for a second. Is there anything you need from town? He asked. Clara had a list ready. She had been keeping it in her head since the day she arrived, reorganizing it by priority, crossing things off as she found them in corners of the cellar and the backs of shelves. She handed him the paper version she'd written out that morning. He looked at it. His eyebrows rose slightly. This is thorough, he said. I'm a thorough person, she said. He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket and walked out. He was gone 4 hours. In those 4 hours, Clara scrubbed the front parlor top to bottom, fixed the hinge on the back door that had been sticking since she arrived, taught Eliza the beginning of a recipe for apple butter that Eliza immediately decided was the most important skill she had ever acquired, and had a conversation with Thomas that she had not been expecting and that stayed with her long after it was over. Thomas came to find her while she was working on the hinge, crouching in the doorway with a small oil can she'd found in the barn. He stood at a distance and watched her work with the particular expression of a 9-year-old boy who has something to say and has not yet decided whether saying it is worth the risk. You can ask me, she said without looking up from the hinge. A pause. How did you know I was going to ask something? You've been standing there for 3 minutes, she said. People who just want to watch don't stand that still. He came closer. He sat on the step beside the door, which put him at roughly her level, and looked at his own hands. Miss Clara, he said. Just Clara's fine. Clara, he tried it. Did you come here because you wanted to, or because you had to? She looked at him then. He was still looking at his hands. Both, she said honestly. He looked up. I wanted to come, she said, but I also didn't have a lot of other good options. Those two things can both be true at the same time. She set the oil can down. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Some of the boys at school say Papa felt sorry for you, because of how you look. The words landed the way words from a child always do, direct, without the wrapping that adults use to make hard things sound softer. Clara kept her face even. And what do you think? She asked. Thomas considered this with a seriousness she had come to expect from him. I think Papa doesn't do things because he feels sorry, he said slowly. I think he does things because he's thought them through and decided they make sense. Another pause. I think he decided you made sense. Clara looked at this boy, this careful, honest, grief-weathered boy, and felt something that was not quite tenderness, but was close to it. Something more complicated than tenderness. You're smart, she said. Mama said I got it from her, he said. I believe that, Clara said. He stood up. He shoved his hands in his pockets. He took 2 steps and stopped. I'm glad you came, he said, facing away from her. Even if the other kids say things. He walked off before she could answer. She stood in the doorway with the oil can in her hand and the newly working hinge behind her and watched him go. And she thought this family has been hurting in ways that nobody's been tending. She was going to tend it. Nathaniel came back from town with the supplies and something else. She knew something was wrong the moment she heard the wagon come through the gate because the pace of it was different. He drove it with more restraint than usual, the kind of deliberate control that a man exercises when he's working hard to keep something from showing on his face. She came out to help unload, and he handed down the packages without meeting her eyes. She waited. It wasn't until the last box was inside and the horse was settled, and there was no more practical thing to be done, that he came into the kitchen and stood there with his hands at his sides and said, "There's talk in town." She poured him coffee. "About me?" she asked. "About us." He accepted the coffee. "About how this arrangement looks. Some people saying things." He stopped, started again. "Victoria's father, George Hale. He was at the feed store when I came in." His jaw tightened. He made a point of being there. "What did he say?" "He didn't say much directly. That's not how George Hale works." Nathaniel turned the cup in his hands. "He suggested that a man in my position ought to think carefully about appearances, about how certain choices reflect on a man's standing in the community." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He means me." "Yes." "He means that a man like you shouldn't have a woman like me in his house." Nathaniel set the cup down on the table hard enough to make a sound. "He doesn't have any business saying a word about who's in my house." "No," Clara said calmly. "He doesn't. But he said it anyway." She sat down across from him. "What else?" He looked at her. "Mr. Carter." She kept her voice level. "I'm not going to fall apart. What else?" He exhaled. "He's on the bank board," he said. "The note I have on the North Pasture expansion, it comes due in 7 months. George Hale has influence over whether that note gets renewed or called in." There it was. Not just a man making unpleasant comments at a feed store. A man with leverage making a calculated point. Clara sat with that for a moment. "He wants you to send me back," she said. "He wants me to understand who holds what cards," Nathaniel said. "Same thing, different way of saying it." "And what do you intend to do?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time, and in that look she read something she hadn't been expecting. Not just anger at George Hale, though that was there. Something else. Something that was working itself out in real time behind his eyes. "I intend," he said slowly, "to pay that note in full before it comes due, so that George Hale can take his influence and his suggestions and conduct himself accordingly." Clara blinked. "That's a significant amount of money," she said carefully. "Yes," he said. "It is." "Do you have it?" "Not yet," he said. "But I'll find a way." He picked up the coffee cup again. "I always have." She looked at him. She thought this man has been alone so long, he's forgotten that finding a way by himself is not the only way to find it. She didn't say that yet. Instead she said, "Can I see the books?" He stared at her. "The ranch books. You said in your letter that you needed someone who could manage a household," she said. "Books are part of management." She held his gaze. "Let me look at them. You've got a problem. Maybe a second pair of eyes finds something you've been too close to see." A long pause. Then he got up and went to his office, and came back with a ledger that was thick with years of entries, and he put it on the table in front of her. She opened it. She read. For 2 hours she sat at that kitchen table, and read while Nathaniel tried to work on other things and failed, kept appearing in doorways, kept moving around the house, with the restless energy of a man who has handed over something important and isn't sure whether that was right. Finally she looked up. "Your operation is solid," she said. "The cattle yield is strong. Your feed costs are high but manageable." She turned back 3 pages. You have one problem." He came and stood behind her and leaned over to look where she was pointing. She was very aware of how close he was. She did not let herself think about that. "Keegan's contract," he said. "You're paying Keegan's freight company 30% more than the going rate for cattle transport to Cheyenne," she said. "You've been paying it for 4 years." He was quiet. "Is Keegan a friend?" she asked. "He was," Nathaniel said. "His father and my father did business. I kept the contract when Keegan took over." Clara kept her voice even. "At 30% above market rate over 4 years, you've paid approximately," she did the arithmetic she'd been running in her head, $1,800 more than you needed to. The silence that followed had a specific texture. "That's not the only way to close the gap," she said. "But it's a start." She looked up at him over her shoulder. "Keegan know the current market rates." "He knows," Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone to something flat and quiet. "Then he's been taking advantage of the fact that you didn't look closely enough," she said. "Or that you were too loyal to look." She watched his face process that, watched the different things it moved through the surprise. First, then the calculation, then something that looked a great deal like a man recognizing something he had not wanted to see. "I'll need to renegotiate," he said. "Or find another freight company," she said. "Whichever sends the clearer message." He straightened up. He was quiet for a long moment, standing above her in the kitchen, and she could feel him working through something. "How did you learn to read books like that?" he asked. "My father kept accounts for 3 businesses, and he had no sons," she said simply. "I was what he had." Something in his expression shifted again. "Did he teach you?" "He taught me everything," she said. "And then he died, and the businesses all went to his business partners, because that's what the law allowed, and I went to work in a laundry in Columbus." She said it without bitterness, because the bitterness had been there long enough that it had burned down to something quieter and more durable. "I didn't stop being able to read books just because nobody wanted to pay me for it." Nathaniel sat down across from her. He looked at her in a different way than he had been looking at her. Not the recalibration look, not the careful, decent, trying to be fair look, something that was starting to be more direct than either of those. "Clara," he said. "Yes. Who taught you to cook?" She blinked. It was not the question she expected. "My grandmother, like I said." "And the household management?" "Grandmother for some of it, father for some. Some of it I just—" She paused. "Some of it I worked out on my own. And the account books." "My father." "And the medical—" He stopped himself. "Last week with Rufus." "My mother had a lot of children," she said. "Half of them made it to adulthood. She got practical about it early." He looked at her. He looked at her like someone who has been holding a stone in his hand for a long time, thinking it was just a stone, and has just now understood it is something else entirely. "I need to go check on the east fence," he said abruptly. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He was halfway to the door when he stopped. "Clara," he said without turning around. "Yes?" "Thank you." A pause. "For the books. For all of it." He walked out. She sat at the table with the ledger still open in front of her and looked at the door. She thought, well, there it is. Something was beginning between them that had not been there before, and they both knew it, and neither one of them had the first idea what to do about it. But she did not have long to think about it, because trouble has a habit in that part of the world of arriving before you've finished dealing with the last piece of it. The next morning, Danny came running from the bunkhouse, before breakfast was done, with his face doing something complicated between urgency and trying not to look like he was panicking. He stopped at the back door. "Miss Clara," he said. "Is the boss in?" "He's out with Hector," she said. "What's wrong?" Danny turned his hat in his hands. "The water on the south grazing field," he said. "The creek that feeds it. We think somebody dammed it upstream." Clara put down the spoon she was holding. When? Overnight, he said. Rufus found it this morning. The cattle been moving toward the dry ground. She thought quickly. How long before that field dries out enough to matter? 2-3 days, Danny said. Maybe 4 if we get lucky. Go find Nathaniel, she said. He needs to know now. Danny was already moving. But Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and let the implications of what he'd just said settle over her like the start of a cold rain. The freight contract being 30% over market, the banknote coming due, George Hale at the feed store making his point, and now water being cut off from the south field overnight. This was not a coincidence. George Hale was not just making social commentary about appearances. He was running a campaign. She was in Nathaniel's office when he came back in from the south field. Hector behind him. Both of them moving with the compressed, efficient energy of men who have assessed a problem and are working out what to do about it. He stopped when he saw her at his desk with papers spread in front of her. The dam's been built on Shelton's land, Hector said from the doorway. Old Eli Shelton, he sold off the North Quarter 3 months ago. Somebody bought it through an agent paid cash. Nobody knows who. Clara looked up. I think I might know who, she said. Both men looked at her. She had been in Nathaniel's files for 20 minutes, following a thread from the ledger that had pulled at her the night before. Something about a land transaction reference that didn't belong in a ranch account book. A number that seemed out of place until she found the correspondence folded into the back of a secondary ledger that she suspected Nathaniel hadn't opened in 2 years. George Hale has been buying land along your north and south water sources for 18 months, she said, through an agent named Dorsey, paying cash each time through a bank in Casper so it doesn't show up in the local records. She put the correspondence on the desk and turned it so he could read it. This letter is from Dorsey to a freight company, a different freight company than Keegan arranging transport for construction materials. Lumber, pipes, the kind of thing you'd use to build a dam. The room was very quiet. Hector said a word that Clara chose not to respond to. Nathaniel stood very still and read the letter twice. She watched him read it. She watched the precise moment when he understood not just what it said, but what it meant, the full architecture of it. The 18 months of patient, deliberate maneuvering the land and the freight contract and the banknote and the appearance at the feed store. All of it part of a single plan. To squeeze him. To make the ranch unsustainable. To buy it at a ruined price. He wants the ranch, Nathaniel said. His voice was very quiet. He wants the water rights that come with your land, Clara said. Your ranch sits on the best water in this part of the territory. Anyone who owns your land controls irrigation access for 3 counties. She paused. That's not a cattleman's scheme. That's a politician's scheme. Hector swore again. Nathaniel put the letter down on the desk. He looked at Clara. She met his eyes and waited. You found all this, he said. The thread was already there, she said. You just needed someone to pull it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do we do? And she thought he said we. Not what do I do? What do we do? She said, First, we open the dam. That's today. That's right now. Send men up to Shelton's old quarter and take it apart. Hale might have bought that land, but you have a right to the water that feeds your property, and there are territorial laws that say so. She moved to the next point. Second, you get these letters to a lawyer, not someone in Millhaven, someone in Cheyenne who isn't connected to Hale's bank. You get copies made and you keep them in 2 separate places. She looked at him steadily. Third, and this is the part you're not going to like. Tell me anyway, he said. Third people in this community need to know what Hale has been doing, not because it's satisfying, because Hale's scheme depends on people not knowing. He is planning to control the water for 3 counties. There are other ranchers, other farmers, other people whose livelihoods run on those water rights. She paused. You're not the only one he's coming for. You're just the biggest piece of the plan. Nathaniel stared at her. He's going to find out, you know, he said. Yes, she said. That makes things harder. It makes things more honest, she said. Which isn't the same as harder. Another silence. Hector from the doorway said quietly, Boss, she's right. Nathaniel picked up the letter again and looked at it for a moment. He had the expression of a man who has spent years handling everything himself and is in the process of accepting for the first time that everything might be handled better with someone beside him. "All right," he said. He looked at Clara. "All right," he said again differently. "They sent men to open the dam that afternoon. 6 men. Nathaniel led them himself, which Clara noticed and didn't comment on because it was not the moment to comment on it. What she did do was make sure there was food ready when they came back, because men who've done hard physical work in cold weather and emotional anger need feeding before they can think clearly about the next step. They came back at dark, cold and tired, and with something relieved in their posture, the specific relief of action taken after time spent waiting. Nathaniel came straight to the kitchen. He looked at the food on the table and then at her. "It's down," he said. "Good," she said. "Sit." He sat. The hands came in and filled the table, and the room was loud and warm, and Clara moved around it the way she had every night for 2 weeks now, but this night was different from the others. This night there was something in the air, some kind of we did a thing together that ran through all of them like a current. Hector raised his coffee cup. "To the woman who reads books better than any man in this territory," he said. There was a general sound of agreement around the table. Clara felt color come to her face and was grateful for the warmth of the stove as cover. "I just looked at what was there," she said. "Most people look right at a thing and don't see it," Hector said. "That ain't looking. That's seeing. Different skill entirely." She looked across the table at Nathaniel. He was already looking at her. He held her gaze for 1 beat longer than he needed to, and then he looked down at his plate. But in that 1 beat, she saw something she had not seen there before. Not gratitude, not the careful regard of a fair employer, something that was working its way up from somewhere deeper than either of those things, something he hadn't invited and wasn't ready to name. She looked away first. She went to the stove and kept her hands busy and let the noise of the table fill the space around her while she stood there and felt with more certainty than she'd felt anything in a long time that what was happening in this house was no longer just an arrangement. It was becoming something else. And George Hale was not going to like it. Outside, the wind had picked up from the northwest, the kind of wind that carried information about the winter coming, the hard months that would test every person and every structure on that open land. Clara stood at the stove and listened to the sound of the people she had fed, filling the room behind her. And she thought, let it come. She had weathered worse. And this time, for the first time in her life, she was not weathering it alone. The lawyer's name was Edmund Hart, and he practiced out of Cheyenne, which was 4 hours by fast horse from Carter Ranch, which meant Nathaniel had to leave before dawn to reach him in 1 day and return before nightfall of the next. He told Clara this the evening before he planned to go standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat already on his head, even though it was 8 o'clock at night and he had nowhere to go until morning. And she understood that the hat was a kind of armor for him, something he put on when he was working through something difficult and needed to feel like he was already in motion. "I'll be gone 2 days, he said. "Hector will be here." "I know," she said. "I'll manage." He looked at her. There was something he wanted to say. She could see it moving around behind his eyes, working itself toward words and not quite getting there. "The letters," he said finally. "The copies I made. I left one set in the strongbox in the office. The other set." He paused. "I want you to hold them." Clara went still. "You want me to hold them?" she repeated. "If something happens while I'm on the road," he said. "If someone comes to the ranch, if Hale figures out we've got the evidence before I can get it to Hart." He stopped. "I trust you to know what to do with them." The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about what that meant. Not just the practical thing holding a set of papers keeping them safe. She thought about the fact that this man who 2 weeks ago had stood on a train platform doing the mental arithmetic of disappointment was now standing in her kitchen in the dark, telling her that she was the person he trusted with the most dangerous thing he owned. "All right," she said. He reached into his coat and handed her a folded oilskin packet the kind meant for keeping things dry in bad weather. Their hands touched in the exchange. Neither of them remarked on it. But she felt it long after he'd walked out. He left at 4 in the morning. She heard the horse she had been lying awake already. Not with worry exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone who has taken on responsibility and feels the weight of it. She listened to the sound of him go, and then lay still in the dark, and thought about what was in the packet under her mattress, and what George Hale was willing to do to protect what he'd been building for 18 months. By 6 in the morning, she had made breakfast and briefed Hector, and given Danny 3 specific tasks to keep the younger hands occupied and purposeful, because idle men in a tense situation have a way of making the tension worse. By 7, she was in the garden with Eliza, which was where she always tried to be at that hour if she could manage it, because it was Eliza's favorite time with her, and Clara had learned that some investments you make not because they are strategic, but because they are simply right. "Is Papa coming back today?" Eliza asked. "Tomorrow," Clara said. "He told you that this morning." "I know," Eliza said. "I just wanted to say it out loud again." Clara understood that. She understood the need to hear a thing in your own voice to make it more real by saying it. "He'll be back tomorrow afternoon," she said, "before supper." "Will you make the bread he likes for when he gets back?" "Already planning on it," Clara said. Eliza nodded satisfied and went back to her work. Thomas came out 20 minutes later, and he came out at a clip that told Clara something had happened before he said a word. "There's a man at the front gate," he said. "He says he wants to talk to whoever's in charge." "What kind of man?" Hector said from behind him. Hector had materialized the way Hector tended to quietly and completely, as if he had always been standing there. Thomas looked at Hector. "The kind that's got 2 other men with him, and they're all wearing guns on their belts." Hector looked at Clara. Clara straightened up and handed her garden gloves to Eliza. "Take your sister inside," she told Thomas. "Use the back door. Stay in the kitchen." "But, Thomas..." Her voice was not loud, but it had something in it that made him stop. "I need you to do that right now." He took Eliza's hand and went. Clara walked to the front gate. The man waiting there was not someone she recognized, which meant he was not from Millhaven, which meant George Hale had hired from somewhere else. He was broad across the chest, with a face that had been arranged by hard living into something that was not quite a scowl, but rested comfortably in that direction. The 2 men behind him were younger and less interesting. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a gesture that was technically polite and felt entirely like the opposite. "Can I help you?" Clara said. "I'm looking for Nathaniel Carter." "He's not here," she said. The man smiled in a way that didn't reach anywhere above his chin. "That's so. And who might you be?" "I'm the person standing at this gate," Clara said. "What is your business with Mr. Carter?" A pause. He was recalibrating her the same way people always did, except this one was recalibrating in a different direction, not dismissing her, but trying to decide whether she was a problem that needed to be taken seriously. "Got a message from a business associate," he said, "regarding some property matters." "You can leave the message with me," Clara said. "I'll see that he gets it." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "Message is that the note on his North Pasture expansion has been reviewed by the board. They're calling it due early. End of next month." Clara did not blink. "The note isn't due for 7 months," she said. "Was," he said pleasantly. "Terms changed. Business circumstances." He smiled again. "Mr. Carter will want to make arrangements." "Mr. Carter will want to speak with his lawyer," Clara said, "which is where he is right now." The smile didn't move, but something behind it did. He hadn't known about the lawyer. She watched that register and file it away. "Well," he said, "you tell him the board's position." "I'll tell him everything," Clara said. Every word of this conversation, in fact, including the time, the date, and a description of the 3 men who delivered it. The 2 younger men behind him shifted slightly. The broad man looked at her for a long moment. Then he touched his hat brim again. "Ma'am," he said, and turned his horse. She watched them go until they were down the road and past the tree line. Then she turned and walked back to the house and kept her spine straight and her pace even, because Hector was watching from the barn door, and she was not going to let him see the shake in her hands. She made it to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. "They gone," Hector said from the back door. "They're gone," she said. "What did they want?" She told him. His face went through several things while she talked anger calculation and finally something that looked like a very particular form of respect. "He's calling the note early?" Hector said. "That's Hale. That's him pushing." "Yes," Clara said, "because he knows Nathaniel's at a lawyer, or because he doesn't know and he's pushing anyway to see what happens." She turned around. "Either way, Nathaniel needs to know the moment he comes back tomorrow. And in the meantime, I need to think." Hector looked at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that George Hale has been playing a long, patient game, and he's not used to anyone playing back." She looked at Hector. "How many ranchers in this territory does Hale's water scheme affect if he gets control of the rights?" Hector thought. "Directly. 7-8 operations. Small ones mostly. Couple of farms. And how many of those people know what Hale's been buying up?" "None of them," Hector said. "That's the point of using a Casper bank and an agent." "Right," Clara said. "So they don't know they're in danger." She was quiet for a moment. "If they knew, would they stand with Nathaniel?" Hector was quiet for a longer moment. "Some of them. Maybe most. Walt Pruitt's been on that land 3 generations. He finds out somebody's scheming to take his water rights, he'll—" He stopped. "Yeah, Walt would stand." "Then we need to talk to Walt Pruitt," Clara said. Hector stared at her. "That's a day's ride." "I know," she said. "Not today, but we need to start thinking about who Nathaniel can bring to his side before Hale moves his next piece." She met Hector's eyes. "George Hale has money, and he has a bank, and he has lawyers. What Nathaniel has is that he's been a good neighbor for 15 years and hasn't done a single underhanded thing in all that time." She paused. "That's worth something. We just have to make sure people know it's time to decide whose side they're on." Hector was silent for a beat. Then he said, "You know, when Nathaniel told us he'd sent away for a wife, we all figured it'd be somebody who'd manage the kitchen and maybe keep him from forgetting to eat." Clara looked at him. "We were wrong," Hector said simply, "about what he needed." She turned back to the counter before he could see what that did to her face. Nathaniel came back the next afternoon as promised at 2 hours before supper. He came in fast, which told her the Cheyenne trip had given him information that put urgency in his spine, and he came in the front door instead of the barn, which told her he wanted to talk before he did anything else. He found her in the kitchen. She had started tracking where she was when he arrived, and she was always in the kitchen, which she thought about sometimes with a feeling she couldn't quite categorize, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her and said, "Hart thinks we have a strong case." "Sit down," she said. "There's something you need to hear first." He sat. She told him about the men at the gate, about the message, about the note being called early. She watched his face while she talked, watched it go through the same things Hector's had, except faster, and with more control over the surface of it. When she finished, he was very still. "End of next month," he said. "That's what the man said." "That's 6 weeks." "Yes." He looked at the table. She could see him running numbers in his head, the same kind of arithmetic she'd been running since the man at the gate told her the kind where you add up what you have and subtract what you owe, and look at the remainder and try to figure out if it's enough. "Hart wants the original letters," he said. "He thinks with those and the land purchase records he can file an injunction against Hale through the territorial court. Block the water rights claim before it can be formalized." He paused. "That buys time. It doesn't solve the note." "No," Clara agreed. 6 weeks to pay off a note that was supposed to give me 7 months, he said. "Or 6 weeks to make Hale back down," she said. He looked up at her. "I talked to Hector," she said. About the other ranchers, the ones whose water access is part of Hale's scheme. She kept her voice even. If those people understand what's happening, not rumors, not secondhand, but actual evidence of what Hale's been buying, and why they have as much reason to fight this as you do. Going to the other ranchers, he said slowly. That's making this public. It's already public, she said. Hale made it public the moment he sent those men to your gate with a message that half the hands on this ranch heard. She leaned forward slightly. He wants you isolated. He wants you to handle this alone and quietly, because alone and quiet is how he wins. The moment other people understand what's at stake, it stops being just your problem. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something she hadn't expected. Clara, he said. You could leave. She stopped. I mean it, he said. This is my fight. Hale's got reach, and he's not a gentle man when he decides somebody's in his way. If this goes wrong... He stopped. You didn't sign on for this. She looked at him for a long moment. Nathaniel Carter, she said. And it was the first time she'd said his first name out loud, and she watched him register that. I signed on to run your household. Your household is in trouble, so this is exactly what I signed on for. She held his gaze. And I don't leave when things get hard. That is, in fact, the one thing I have never done in my entire life. Something moved across his face. He said, No, I don't reckon you have. He reached across the table, and for one breath, she thought he was going to take her hand, but instead, he picked up the cup of coffee she'd poured when she heard his horse, and he drank it. And he looked at her over the rim with those steady, weathered eyes that had seen too much and were in the process of deciding, she thought, whether they were willing to see something new. All right, he said. Tell me your thinking on the other ranchers. They planned until dark. It was the kind of planning that feels like something else, like two people who have learned the shape of each other's minds and are discovering with a kind of surprised attention how well those shapes fit together. She thought out loud, and he pushed back when he disagreed, which she found she valued more than she expected. He knew things about the specific men, the histories, the old grievances and alliances that ran between the ranching families of that territory like underground water. She knew how to build the argument, how to frame the evidence so it was undeniable, how to structure a presentation so the conclusion felt inevitable rather than argued. By the time Eliza came to find them, because supper was past ready, and she was of the opinion that waiting any longer was unreasonable, they had a plan. The next 3 days moved fast. Nathaniel rode to Walt Pruitt first. Clara had suggested Walt because Hector said Walt would be the hardest to convince and the most valuable to have, which was the logic of someone who understood that when you're building a coalition, you start with the hardest brick, not the easiest, because if the hardest holds, the rest follow. He was gone a full day. He came back with Walt Pruitt riding beside him. Walt was a large man in his 60s, with a manner that suggested he had sat on juries and found verdicts and was prepared to do so again. He came into the kitchen and sat down, and Clara put food in front of him and let Nathaniel lay out the evidence while she listened from the stove and watched Walt's face move through the stages of a man learning something that reorders his understanding of a situation he thought he knew. When Nathaniel finished, Walt was quiet for a full minute. Then he said, "How long you figure he's been at this?" 18 months of land purchases we can document, Clara said from the stove. Probably longer in the planning. Walt looked at her directly. He had not looked at her directly before, and she had noticed it without making anything of it the way you notice weather you've decided not to take personally. "You the one found it?" he asked. "I found it in the books," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at Nathaniel. "Your wife's smarter than you," he said. Nathaniel almost smiled. "I'm aware," he said. Clara kept her face toward the stove and did not let herself react to the word wife, which Nathaniel had not corrected, which she filed away in the place where she kept things that required more thought than she had time for right now. Walt left that evening with a copy of the key documents and the names of 3 other ranchers. He said he'd talk to personally, which was better than anyone else talking to them, because Walt Pruitt's word in that territory was a different currency than most men's. The following morning, Victoria Hale arrived, not with a wagon this time. On horseback riding alone, which was so different from her first visit that Clara felt the difference in her chest before she had time to think about what it meant. She came to the back door, not the front, which was another difference, and she knocked, which was the most significant difference of all. Clara opened it. Victoria was wearing riding clothes, and her dark hair was looser than usual, and there was something in her face that Clara had not seen there before. Something that had been stripped back like weather had gotten to a varnished surface, and the wood underneath was showing. "Can I come in?" Victoria said. Clara stepped back and let her in. Victoria sat at the kitchen table without being invited, and put her hands flat on the wood in front of her, which was a posture Clara recognized because she had stood in that exact posture herself, pressing her palms down to keep herself steady. "My father doesn't know I'm here," Victoria said. "I figured," Clara said. She put the coffee pot on without asking. Victoria looked around the kitchen at the evidence of work and warmth, and the bread Eliza had helped make that morning sitting on the board at the ledger, still open on the corner of the counter at the herbs drying from the ceiling beam that Clara had put up last week. "You've changed this house," Victoria said. "It needed changing," Clara said. A silence. "I found something," Victoria said. Clara turned around. Victoria's jaw was tight. "My father has an office at the house. I don't go in it. I've never gone in it." She paused. "I went in it 2 days ago." "What did you find?" Clara asked. Victoria looked at the table. "Letters," she said. "From someone in the Territorial Land Office. Names of people, officials, who my father has been paying." She swallowed. "For land approvals. For water rights certifications that were filed under false names." She looked up. "He hasn't just been buying land, Miss Whitmore. He's been bribing the people who are supposed to regulate it." Clara was very still. This was not the peace she and Nathaniel had found. This was a different peace, a higher peace, a peace that didn't just make Hale a predatory businessman, it made him a criminal. "Do you have them?" Clara asked. Victoria reached inside her coat and put a folded envelope on the table. Clara picked it up and opened it and read quickly. Her hands were steady. Her mind was running very fast. She read through twice. "Victoria," she said. The other woman looked at her. "Do you understand what these mean?" Clara asked. "Not for your father, for you, for your family name." Victoria's face did something complicated and painful. "Yes," she said. "I understand." "And you came anyway." "What he's doing is wrong," Victoria said, and for the first time her voice cracked slightly, the controlled surface giving way to something underneath it that was real and frightened and tired. "I spent a long time telling myself that men like my father play the game the way the game is played, and that's just how it is." She paused. "But people are going to lose their land, their water, their livelihoods. People who have been out here longer than my father has and who never did a thing to deserve it." She looked at Clara with an expression that had none of her earlier assessment in it. "I can't pretend I don't know that." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from Victoria Hale and put 1 cup in front of her. "Tell me everything," Clara said. Victoria talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, Clara had a complete picture, not just Hale's land scheme, but the network underneath it, the names of the officials he'd paid the mechanism of the false certifications, the timeline that went back not 18 months, but 3 years. 3 years of patient, careful, methodical corruption. She also had something she hadn't expected. She had Victoria. Not as an enemy, not as someone to be managed or tolerated, as someone who had come in through the back door and knocked and sat at a kitchen table and told the truth at significant personal cost, and who was now looking at Clara with an expression that was asking, without quite being able to say it directly, whether that was enough. "What do I do?" Victoria asked. "With what I know?" You do exactly what you did, Clara said. You give the evidence to people who can use it. She paused. And then you let it go where it goes. My father will. Your father has made his choices, Clara said quietly. For 3 years. She kept her eyes on Victoria's. You're making yours right now. A long silence. Victoria looked at the coffee cup in her hands. You're not what I expected, she said finally. When I came here the first time. No. Clara agreed. I was. Victoria stopped. I wasn't kind to you. No. Clara said again. You weren't. Victoria flinched slightly at the lack of softening. Then, after a moment, she nodded like she had asked for honesty and had gotten it and was deciding to respect that. I'm sorry, she said. Clara looked at her for a moment. Everyone deserves a chance to become better than who they were yesterday, she said. That includes you. Something shifted in Victoria's face. Something that was relief, and something that was Clara thought the specific emotion of a woman who has been performing a role for so long that she's forgotten what her actual face feels like. Thank you, Victoria said, quietly, like she meant it. Nathaniel came in from the east field at 4 and stopped hard when he saw Victoria at his kitchen table. Clara met his eyes before he could say anything, and held his gaze for 2 beats, which was enough. He understood. He came to the table and sat, and she brought him coffee, and he looked at Victoria and said with controlled evenness, Victoria. Nathaniel, she said. I owe you an apology too. He looked at Clara again. She pushed the envelope across the table toward him. He read the letters. The kitchen was very quiet while he read. Clara could hear the clock on the wall and the sound of the wind outside, and distantly Eliza's voice from somewhere upstairs, talking to one of her dolls, in the serious, explaining tone she used when she was working through something. When Nathaniel finished reading, he set the letters down. He sat there for a moment. Then he said in a very quiet and very controlled voice, He's been bribing land office officials. Yes, Clara said. For 3 years. Yes. He looked at Victoria. His expression was not warm, but it was not hostile either. It was the expression of a man who is recalculating something he thought he understood. Your father, he said. Victoria held his gaze. Yes. Why are you doing this? He asked, not accusatory, genuine. Because it's right, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, and in his eyes, she saw something that she would carry with her for a very long time. A kind of seeing, deep and direct, that had nothing to do with assessment or calculation. Something that looked at her and simply saw her the way she was, where she was doing what she did. Clara, he said, we need to send a rider to Hart tonight, she said, with these letters and the originals from the strongbox. He needs everything before we do anything else. I know, he said. I'll send Danny. He's fast. He didn't move yet. Clara? Yes. I don't know how to say this right, he said. Then say it wrong, she said. I'll take the meaning. He was quiet for a moment. If this works, he said. If Hart gets the injunction and Hale's scheme comes apart. Another pause. This ranch wasn't worth saving if it meant saving it alone. It was not a declaration. It was not the kind of thing that gets said in a novel. It was just a man saying a true thing in the plainest language he could manage. She looked at him. She felt the weight of everything, every year of being seen wrong, every door that closed before she could get her foot in it, every face that rearranged itself in disappointment when she walked into a room, and she also felt for the first time in longer than she could name that those things were not the whole of her story. Then let's make sure it works, she said. She went to the door and called for Danny. Outside, the early dark of a Wyoming autumn was coming down fast, and somewhere in the territory, George Hale was making his next move without knowing that 2 women who had never expected to be in the same room were sitting at a kitchen table with evidence that was about to take everything he'd built and turn it into ash. He did not yet know that the woman he had dismissed as unimportant had been the one who found it. He would find out. Very soon. He would find out exactly what kind of woman Clara Whitmore was, and it would be the last miscalculation he ever made. Danny rode out before full dark with both sets of letters tucked inside his coat against his skin, which was Clara's idea, not in a saddlebag where they could be taken, but on his body, where getting to them would require a different kind of decision entirely. She watched him go from the back step and then went inside and did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe around her. Nathaniel's footsteps across the floor above her back and forth, the same restless pattern she had learned to recognize as his version of the thinking she did at kitchen tables. Eliza's complete stillness. That child slept like someone had switched her off absolute and total, which Clara found comforting in a way she hadn't expected. Thomas's occasional creak of a bed spring, the sound of a boy who slept lightly, because he'd learned early that the world could change while you weren't watching. She thought about George Hale in his house right now, in his office with his letters, and his plans, not yet knowing that his daughter had walked out of that office with the most dangerous pieces of it folded inside her coat. She thought about Edmund Hart in Cheyenne, who would have Danny knocking on his door by tomorrow morning. She thought about Walt Pruitt and the 3 names Walt had taken with him. She thought about Nathaniel saying this ranch wasn't worth saving if it meant saving it alone. She lay in the dark, and she held all of it, and for the first time since she had stepped off a train platform in Millhaven, with one suitcase and a speech she had rehearsed for 200 miles, she felt the specific and unfamiliar sensation of not being alone in a fight. It was a strange feeling. She wasn't sure she trusted it yet, but she held it anyway carefully, the way you hold something you have wanted for so long that having it feels almost like a trick. Morning came. With it came a rider that nobody had sent for. He arrived at 7 before the breakfast dishes were cleared, a young man Clara didn't know, who wore the look of someone who had been riding since before dawn, and had a message he was not pleased to be carrying. He asked for Nathaniel. Nathaniel came out. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched through the window. She saw Nathaniel read the paper the young man handed him. She saw his face do something that it very rarely did, which was to show without control or filtration exactly what was happening inside him. Then he folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket and came inside. "That was from the bank," he said. Clara waited. "Not just the note," he said. "They've reviewed my entire account. They're saying there are irregularities in my land title on the east pasture. They want documentation by the end of the week or they're freezing the account." She was very still. "That's not a banking decision," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." "Hale knows," she said. "Or he suspects. He's moving faster because he knows something shifted." Nathaniel looked at her. "Victoria," he said. "Maybe. Or maybe one of the other ranchers Hale has people watching said something," she was already thinking. "Either way, he's compressing the timeline. He wants this resolved before Hart can file anything." "Can Hart file in time?" "Danny's been riding since last night," she said. "Hart should have the letters by this afternoon. Whether he can move fast enough?" She stopped. "I don't know." Nathaniel sat down heavily. It was the first time she had seen him do that, sit down with weight, with the posture of a man whose endurance has been running a long time and just hit a wall it wasn't expecting. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "That east pasture land title is clean," he said. "My father bought it in '68. There are no irregularities." "I know," she said. "They're manufacturing a problem." "Yes. So even if Hart files, they can tie things up with the fabricated title question long enough to call the note and freeze the account and—" "Yes," she said. "That's the move." He looked up at her. She looked back at him. "Unless," she said. He waited. "The land office irregularities they're claiming," she said slowly. "They'd have to be on file, somewhere in the territorial land records. A claim or a flag or a notation, something that justifies the bank's position." She paused. "Victoria said her father had been paying land office officials." If Hale manufactured a title problem, someone in that office put it there. So it's a fake notation in the land records, Nathaniel said. Which means it was put there recently, she said. Which means there's a date on it. He stared at her. And if the date on the notation is more recent than the bank's letter claiming they just discovered it, she said, then the bank's timeline falls apart. They knew about a problem before the problem existed. That's not a banking irregularity. She held his gaze. That's fraud. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Nathaniel stood up. I need to get to the land office, he said. Cheyenne, she said. Not Millhaven. Millhaven's office feeds into the Cheyenne records. You need the territorial archive. That's where Hart is. That's where Hart is, she agreed. He was already moving toward the door. Nathaniel, she said. He stopped. Take Hector, she said. Don't go alone. He looked back at her. There was something in the look that was not just acknowledgement. Something that was warmer and more specific than the careful, decent regard he'd started with, and different too from the growing professional respect she'd been watching build over 2 weeks. Something that had no practical content and was simply about the fact of her standing there. All right, he said. He was gone within the hour, Hector beside him. Clara stood on the back step and watched them go, same as she'd watched Danny go the night before, and then she turned and went inside and faced the reality of a ranch to run 2 children to keep steady, and a plan that was now moving in multiple directions simultaneously, any one of which could go wrong before the others could compensate. She made breakfast for the children, as if nothing had changed, because keeping things normal for Eliza and Thomas was itself a form of strategy. Children read the adults around them with an accuracy that most adults underestimate, and a frightened child has a way of becoming a frightened adult's problem before anyone is ready for it. Eliza asked where Papa was. Cheyenne, Clara said. He'll be back tomorrow or the day after. Again, Eliza said with the particular mournfulness of a 6-year-old whose father's absences had not yet become routine enough to stop hurting each time. There's important business, Clara said. Eliza looked at her oatmeal. Is someone trying to take the ranch? She asked. Clara stopped. Why do you ask that? She said carefully. Eliza kept looking at her bowl. I heard Papa and Hector. Last night, through the floor. She paused. Papa said something about losing everything. Clara sat down across from her. She thought this child has already lost her mother. She has been listening through floors for years, trying to understand what is happening to the world. She depends on trying to hear whether the sounds from below are the sounds of safety or the sounds of danger. Someone is trying to cause trouble for the ranch, Clara said. Yes. Eliza looked up. But your papa is working on it, Clara said. And I'm working on it, and Hector, and some other people. She held the small girl's gaze. There are more people on our side than on their side. That matters. Eliza considered this. Are you scared? She asked. Clara thought about giving the easy answer. Then she thought about what kind of woman she wanted this child to learn from. A little, she said honestly. But being scared and being stopped are 2 different things. Eliza nodded slowly, processing this. Then she said, okay, and went back to her oatmeal with the practicality of someone who has received the information they needed and is ready to move on. Thomas, who had been sitting at the other end of the table, in the specific silence of a boy who is listening without appearing to listen, looked at Clara over the rim of his cup. She looked back at him. He gave a small nod barely visible, the nod of a 9-year-old who had decided that something was all right. She held that. The day was long. The ranch ran. The men did their work, and Clara did hers, and she stayed in constant, low-level motion the way she had learned to do when anxiety would otherwise find places to pool and deepen. She aired the front parlor. She worked on the week's accounts. She made a list of every document they had, every piece of evidence, and where each copy was. She wrote a letter to Edmund Hart summarizing the land title question, and the bank's letter, and the timeline, because if Hart was in possession of the facts before Nathaniel arrived, things would move faster. She sent it with a ranch hand named Collins, who was making a supply run to Millhaven, and could put it on the noon post to Cheyenne. At 3 in the afternoon, George Hale arrived. Not with hired men this time, himself. He drove his own wagon alone, which was either a gesture of personal authority or a calculated signal that he did not consider this visit to require reinforcement. He was in his 60s. George Hale, a big man, who had once been heavier, and now carried the particular leanness of someone who has burned away everything except ambition. He had a face that Clara suspected had once been handsome, and had settled over decades of hard use into something more durable than handsome. He came to the front door. Clara opened it before he knocked. She had seen him coming from the kitchen window. He looked at her with an expression she had not yet seen directed at her in this territory, not dismissal, not assessment, but the direct, attentive look of a man who has decided that the person in front of him is relevant to what he's trying to accomplish. That told her something important about how yesterday had gone. He knew Victoria had been here. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'd like to come in." "Mr. Carter isn't here," she said. "I know," he said. "I came to speak with you." She stepped back and let him in. She brought him to the front parlor, not the kitchen. The kitchen was hers. She wasn't giving him the kitchen. He sat in the chair across from the settee and looked around the room with the deliberate appraisal of a man who is calculating the value of everything he can see. Then he looked at her. "You've been busy," he said. "I'm a busy person," she said. "I hear you've been going through Carter's books," he said, "looking into certain business relationships." "I help manage the household accounts," she said. "That's what I was brought here to do." "And visiting with my daughter," he said. Clara met his eyes and said nothing. "She came here yesterday," he said. "I know she did. Victoria is—" He paused, and something moved through his expression. Something that was almost human. Something that was a father's feeling for a child, even in a man who had decided long ago that everything, including his family, was a piece on a board he was playing. "She is young," he said. "She has certain ideas about right and wrong that are, shall we say, incomplete." "She seemed very clear-thinking to me," Clara said. His jaw tightened slightly. "Whatever she may have told you—" "Mr. Hale," Clara said. She kept her voice completely even. "What is it you came here to say?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his hands on his knees in the posture of a man who has decided to be direct because indirection is no longer serving him. "I came to make a proposition," he said. "All right. Carter's operation is sound," he said. "He's a good rancher. I don't have a personal quarrel with the man." He paused. "My interest in this territory is in the water rights. That is the asset that matters to my long-term plans. Not Carter's cattle, not his land in particular." Another pause. "If Carter is willing to negotiate a water rights agreement, a formal arrangement that gives my interests access to the water on his north and south boundaries in exchange for a fair payment and the resolution of the current banking situation, there is no reason this needs to go any further." Clara listened to this. She thought, he doesn't know about Hart. He doesn't know Nathaniel is at the land archive right now. He thinks the letters Victoria brought were the extent of what we have, and he's come here to negotiate with the woman he thinks is manageable while the man is away. He came here to go through her to get to Nathaniel. She felt something very cold and very clear move through her. "You're offering to make the bank situation go away," she said, "in exchange for the water rights." "A formal agreement," he said. "Legally documented. Fair compensation. And the note would be renewed at the original terms," he said. "The recent complications with the account would be resolved." "I see," she said. He watched her. "You're asking me to recommend this to Mr. Carter," she said. "You have his ear," Hale said. "Anyone can see that." There was something in his tone that was not quite a sneer, but carried the shape of the implication that a woman who had come through a marriage agency had currency with a man that was a specific and limited kind of currency, and he was offering to buy it. She looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'll tell Mr. Carter you came. I'll tell him your offer." She paused. "I'll also tell him the date you made it, which will be useful information for his lawyer." The room went very still. Hale's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just slightly, a tightening. A recalculation, the look of a man who has just understood that the conversation he thought he was having is not the conversation that is actually happening. "His lawyer," he said. "Edmund Hart," she said. "In Cheyenne." Hale did not move for a moment. "Hart has experience with territorial land cases," she said pleasantly, "specifically with cases involving land office records and the people who maintain them." The silence stretched. Clara had spent her entire life in rooms where powerful people looked at her and decided in the space of a breath that she was not something to reckon with. She had spent her entire life in the specific kind of invisibility that belongs to women who don't look the way the world expects, who carry their weight in ways that powerful men read as weakness, who come through back doors and side doors and arrangement agencies and are therefore in the calculation of men like George Hale manageable. She sat across from him in the front parlor of a house she had brought back to life, and she looked at him with complete steadiness and let him understand at his own pace exactly how wrong he had been. He stood. "I see," he said. His voice was careful now, measured. "I'll give Mr. Carter your regards," Clara said. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back, and she saw it. The thing underneath the calculation, the anger that a man like George Hale keeps very well controlled, and very rarely lets show, because showing it is the same as admitting it, has been provoked. "You are not what I expected," he said. "No," she agreed. "I rarely am." He left. She sat in the front parlor for 3 full minutes after she heard his wagon pull away, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and deliberate. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because her hands needed something to do, and she stood at the stove and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened in that room. He had come here to manage her. He had left knowing he couldn't. That was not the end of George Hale. She was not naive enough to think a man who had spent 3 years building something would walk away from it because of one conversation. But something had shifted. Something had changed in the architecture of the situation. Some weight-bearing wall had moved, and she could feel it. She also knew he was going to move faster now. Whatever he did next, he would do it before Nathaniel came back if he could. She needed to think. She was still thinking, still at the stove with the kettle boiling, and her mind 3 steps ahead, when she heard the front gate and looked out and saw with a confusion that took her a full second to resolve that it was not 1 rider, but 4. Walt Pruitt was one of them. And beside Walt Pruitt were 2 men she didn't know and 1 woman she did. The woman was Margaret Ellison, who ran the dry goods in Millhaven with her husband, and who had been in the week since Clara's arrival, the only woman in town who had ever looked at Clara without the social calculation that Victoria had deployed, or the pity that some of the others thought was kindness. Margaret was 61 years old and had crossed 3 territories in a wagon with a husband and 4 children, and opinions she had never once held back for someone else's comfort. Clara opened the front door before they knocked. Walt tipped his hat. "Miss Clara." "Walt," she said. "Margaret." Margaret looked at her with her direct, no-weather-about-it gaze. "Word got around," she said, "about what Hale's been doing." "How much word?" Clara asked. "Enough," Walt said. "My neighbors, their neighbors. Some folks came in from the far ranches this morning when they heard." He paused. "There's people who want to talk to Carter." "He's in Cheyenne," she said. "When's he back?" "Tomorrow, maybe tonight if things moved fast." Walt exchanged a look with the men beside him. "Hale went to see you," Walt said. It wasn't a question. "He left 20 minutes ago," Clara said. "What did he want?" She told them. All of it quickly without embellishment. When she finished, Margaret said, "He offered you a bribe." "He offered me the opportunity to recommend a deal," Clara said. Same thing? Margaret said. Yes, Clara agreed. Same thing. Margaret looked at her with an expression that was, Clara realized, a kind of seeing the same thing Nathaniel's look had been doing over the past weeks, becoming clearer and more direct, like a lens coming into focus. You sent him off, Margaret said. I sent him off, Clara confirmed. Something in Margaret's face did what faces do when they've been watching someone carefully for a while and have just confirmed what they suspected. Good, she said simply. They came inside. All four of them in the kitchen, because Clara brought them there naturally without thinking, the way she had been doing for weeks, bringing people to the kitchen because the kitchen was where things became real, where conversation had substance and decisions had weight. She made coffee and she listened while Walt told her what he knew, not just what she'd told him, but what he'd gathered from the other ranchers, the full extent of what people were now understanding about Hale's scheme. She added what she knew. The men with Walt added pieces of their own. Margaret, who knew everything that moved through Millhaven, because dry goods were the center of all social commerce in a frontier town, and people talked while they waited for their order, added things that surprised even Walt. George Hale had been buying goodwill in Millhaven for 3 years. Donations to the church, money for the school, the kind of generosity that looks like community investment and is actually in the hands of a man like Hale. Reputation insurance. People like him, Margaret said. That's the problem. They've liked him for 3 years, and they've got reasons for it, and now you're asking them to look at those reasons differently. We're not asking them to look at anything, Clara said. The evidence asks, the letters ask, the land records ask. She paused. We just need to make sure people have the chance to see them. A public meeting, Walt said. A gathering, Clara said. At the ranch, if Nathaniel agrees when he gets back. Somewhere people will come because they want to, not because they've been summoned. What kind of gathering? One of the other men asked. Clara thought about her grandmother. About the way her grandmother had believed that feeding people was the closest thing to prayer that a practical person could manage. She thought about what she knew, what she had always known, what had been her one constant skill in a life that had otherwise been defined by things she was told she lacked. We feed them, she said. The room looked at her. People come together over food, she said. They always have. You don't announce a meeting about George Hale and expect people to come, half of them like him and the other half are nervous. But you invite the community to a gathering at Carter Ranch, and you give them a reason that has nothing to do with politics, and they come. She paused. And while they're there because people talk over food, and because Walt and his neighbors and Margaret know how to make sure the right conversations happen, the truth has a chance to move through a crowd, the way truth does when people are relaxed enough to hear it. The kitchen was quiet. Then Margaret said, You want to feed the whole community. I want to give the truth a fair table to sit at, Clara said. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Then she said, What do you need? That was the question that broke something loose in the room the moment when it stopped being Clara's idea and became everyone's plan, which was the only way any plan of this size could work. They talked for 2 hours. Walt knew which ranchers would come. Margaret knew which families in town needed only a reason to say yes. The 2 men brothers, it turned out, who ran a sheep operation to the east and had water rights concerns of their own, knew people in the outlying areas who never came to Millhaven gatherings, but who would ride for this if it was framed right. By the time the sun had moved to late afternoon, they had a list. They had a day 4 days from now, which was tight but possible. They had a division of labor that left nothing without an owner. They did not yet have Nathaniel. But when his horse came through the front gate at 6 o'clock in the evening, earlier than she had expected, and he came in through the back door and stopped at the sight of 4 people sitting at his kitchen table, with Clara at the head of it, and a room full of organized purpose, when he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at all of it. She watched his face move through the quick, accurate reading of a man who trusts what he sees. Tell me, he said. She told him, all of it. Hale's visit, the proposition, the conversation with Walt, the plan. She was precise and fast, because Nathaniel absorbed things better when she gave them to him cleanly, without hedging, which was something she had learned about him the same way she'd learned everything else by watching. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hart filed the injunction." The room went very still. "This afternoon," Nathaniel said. "4 hours ago." The Land Archive had records of the title notation Hale's office planted dated 6 weeks ago. Hart has a sworn statement from the archive clerk that no prior flag existed on that title. The bank's letter claiming they discovered an irregularity predates the date the flag was created. He paused. The bank's position falls apart the moment a court looks at the dates. Walt exhaled. One of the brothers said something low and fervent. Margaret reached out and put her hand over Clara's on the table. A gesture so straightforward and so warm that Clara felt it move through her chest. "So it's over?" Clara asked. "The injunction stops Hale from moving on the water rights claim while the territorial court reviews," Nathaniel said. "It's not over, but he can't make his play while the court's watching." He paused. "And Hart thinks the bribery evidence Victoria brought, if it goes to the territorial attorney, turns this from a civil matter into a criminal one. Then the gathering matters more than ever," Clara said. "Not to fight Hale. To make sure the community understands what's been done before he has a chance to frame it his way." Nathaniel looked at her. "You already organized it," he said. "Not an accusation, a recognition." "I organized the beginning of it," she said. "The ranch is yours. The decision is yours." He looked around the table. Walt, Margaret, the two brothers. He looked at the lists on the table, the notes in Clara's handwriting, the whole careful structure of something that had been built in one afternoon while he was on the road. 4 days, he said to Walt. 4 days, Walt confirmed. Nathaniel looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "All right," he said. He sat down at the table, and she poured him coffee, and the planning continued, and somewhere in the middle of it, without ceremony and without announcement, the way important things often happen in the middle of practical ones, something between them settled into a different shape. She noticed it first in how he talked to her in front of the others, not deferring exactly, but including the way a person includes someone who is in the plan not as support, but as equal architecture. She noticed it in how Walt looked at them together, the small adjustment in Walt's manner that happened when the older man understood perhaps before either of them did what he was looking at. She noticed it in herself, in the specific way she tracked Nathaniel's responses across the table, in the way she had started knowing with a precision that surprised her what he was about to say before he said it, in the way the kitchen felt different when he was in it, not better exactly, but more complete, the way a room feels when the thing that belongs in it has come back. After Walt and the others left, after the children were in bed, after the house had gone quiet, in the particular way of a place that has held a lot of people and is now settling back into itself. Nathaniel found her in the kitchen, washing the cups. He stood in the doorway. She kept washing. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. "You know what I'm going to say?" he asked. "I know you're going to say something," she said. "You've been working up to it for 3 days." She heard him make a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but the shape of one, the outline of it, the first evidence she had that there was laughter somewhere in Nathaniel Carter, that just needed the right conditions to emerge. "I'm not good at this," he said. "At what?" "At saying things," he said. "The kind of things that aren't about business or the ranch or what needs doing." "I noticed," she said. Another sound closer to the laugh this time. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "Since Margaret, since the children's mother. I got used to it. I convinced myself I'd gotten used to it." He stopped. "I hadn't." She set the last cup on the board and turned around. He was standing in the doorway, and he looked for the first time since she'd known him like a man who didn't know exactly what to do with his hands. The hat was on the hook. His hands were at his sides, and he was looking at her with that thing in his eyes that had been building for weeks, that she had been tracking and refusing to name because naming it felt like claiming something she hadn't been offered. "I need to say this right," he said. "You said that before," she reminded him. "I told you to say it wrong." He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked across the kitchen. Not quickly, not dramatically, just directly the way he did everything. with the deliberate, unhurried intention of a man who has made a decision and is following it through. And he stopped an arm's length from her and looked at her from that distance with an expression that was open in a way she had not yet seen from him. "I don't know what I expected when I sent that letter to the agency," he said. "I know it wasn't." He stopped. "I know I was thinking practically. I needed someone to manage the house. I needed the children to have someone. I was not thinking about myself." He paused. "That was a habit I'd gotten into. Not thinking about myself." She waited. "You walked off that train and you told me you weren't pretty," he said. "You said it before I could say anything, before I could do anything, like you were trying to give me an exit, before I could take one." He looked at her. "I want you to know that I have not once since that moment looked at you and thought about what you said on that platform." Her throat tightened slightly. "I have looked at you," he said, "and thought about what you do, and how you think, and how you walk into a room and it changes, and how you talk to my children." He stopped. "And how you looked at George Hale this afternoon, and I wasn't there to see it, but Walt told me how you looked at him, and I want you to know that that did something to me." She didn't trust her voice. "I'm not saying this right," he said. "You're saying it right," she said. "I'm trying to tell you," he said, "that whatever this is, that we arranged whatever practical thing I thought I was doing when I wrote that letter, I'm not interested in it being just that anymore." He met her eyes. "I don't know how to ask you if you feel the same way without it sounding like an accounting problem, but I'm asking." Clara looked at this man. She thought about 25 years of being in rooms where people looked past her. She thought about the train platform and the speech she had rehearsed, the preemptive surrender. The "I ain't pretty" that she had held in front of herself like a shield for so long, she'd started to think it was her face. She thought about Eliza saying, "You're worth more than 10." She thought about Thomas saying, "I'm glad you came." She thought about the kitchen that smelled like cinnamon, and the rolls on Sunday mornings, and the ledger open on the table, and the moment Nathaniel had said "we" instead of "I," and the specific way she had felt that word land. She reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically. Not in the way it happens in the kind of novels Nathaniel's first wife had apparently read. Just directly the way she did everything. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers. Her round, capable, work-worn hands, and she held it. "Nathaniel Carter," she said quietly. "I came here because I had to, and because I wanted to, and both of those things are still true. And somewhere between the freight contract and the dam and George Hale in the front parlor," she paused. "Somewhere in there, this stopped being an arrangement." He looked at their hands. Then he looked at her. "Good," he said. Simple, plain, the one word that meant a beginning, and both of them knew it. He didn't let go of her hand. She didn't let go of his. They stood in the warm kitchen, in the quiet house with the Wyoming night pressing cold against the windows, and the gathering was in 4 days, and George Hale was not finished, and the territorial court had an injunction, and Hart had the bribing evidence, and Walt Pruitt had a list of names, and Margaret Ellison had a community to move, and Clara Whitmore, who had stepped off a train 3 weeks ago with one suitcase and a speech about not being pretty, stood in the kitchen she had brought back to life, and held the hand of a man who had finally learned to see what was in front of him. Tomorrow there would be more to do. There always was. But tonight in the kitchen, something had been named, and it would not go back to being unnamed. The 4 days before the gathering moved the way days move when everything matters faster than you want them to and slower than you can stand. Clara slept 4 hours a night and did not complain about it because complaining required time she didn't have. She cooked in quantities she had never attempted alone, which meant she was not alone. Margaret Ellison came out on the second morning with her daughter-in-law and 2 women from the church who Margaret had recruited with the specific efficiency of someone who had been organizing communities since before half the territory was settled. They took over the second kitchen table without being asked, and simply began, which was the most useful thing anyone had ever done in Clara's presence. The menu was not simple, and it was not meant to be. Clara understood with a precision that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with 30 years of watching her grandmother use food as a language. that what you serve a community you are trying to reach has to say something. It has to say, I made this for you specifically. It has to say, I know what you need. It has to say, you are welcome at this table, all of you, without condition. So she made everything. She made 3 kinds of bread and a venison stew that started at midnight on the 2nd night and ran until noon on the 3rd. She made apple pies, 12 of them, and Eliza helped with every single one. Small hands pressing the edges of crusts with a seriousness that Clara found so affecting, she had to look away twice. She made biscuits in quantities that seemed unreasonable until they were gone in the first hour of the gathering, and she was grateful she had made more than she thought necessary. She made a honey cake that her grandmother had made only at Christmas and that Clara made now because this, she thought, was worth it. Thomas carried things without being asked. She noticed him moving between the kitchen and the long tables Hector and the hands had set up outside, carrying heavy pots with his thin arms and his set jaw, working with the focused intensity of a boy who has decided that this matters and is going to contribute to it with everything he has. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she found him sitting on the back step alone, looking at the field, and she sat beside him. "You all right?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What if people don't believe it?" he said. "What if they like Mr. Hale better than they like us and all this?" He stopped. "What if it doesn't work?" Clara sat with that for a moment. "Then we've fed a lot of people a good meal," she said, "and told the truth in front of witnesses, and let the truth do what truth does." She paused. "I can't promise you it works, Thomas. I can promise you it's right. Those 2 things aren't always the same thing, but right is the one you can stand behind when everything else falls away." He looked at her. "Papa says you don't flinch," he said. It was the 2nd time he had said it. "Your papa's generous," she said. "He's not generous," Thomas said seriously. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. He never has." He looked back at the field. "He means it about you." Clara looked at the field too. She didn't answer because there were things she was still learning how to hold, and that was one of them. Nathaniel had been in motion for 4 days in the way that he was in motion when his mind was fully engaged, not frantic but constant, like a wheel that has found its purpose. He rode to Waltz twice. He met with Hart by letter twice daily. Danny riding the dispatch back and forth with the reliability of a young man who understood that he was part of something important. He spoke with each of the ranch hands individually, which Clara noticed because it was the thing she would have done, and he did it without her suggesting it, making sure every man on the operation understood what was happening and why and what they were being asked to do and not do, which was the management of trust, which was harder than the management of cattle, and more important. In the evenings he came to the kitchen, not always with something to say. Sometimes just to be there in the particular way that people who have been alone a long time come to inhabit a shared space, carefully conscious of it, grateful for it in ways they don't say directly. He would pour coffee and lean against the counter while she worked, and they would talk about the plan, or about the children, or about nothing in particular. And sometimes there were silences that had a quality to them she had never experienced before, the quality of a silence between people who are at ease. On the evening before the gathering, when the food was as prepared as it could be, and the tables were set and the lists had been checked, and there was nothing left to do but wait for morning. He came to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "After this," he said. "However this goes tomorrow after, I want to know what you want." She turned around. "For yourself," he said. "Not for the ranch or the children or any arrangement. What Clara Whitmore wants." She looked at him. Nobody had asked her that in so long that the question took a moment to land properly, to find the right place in her and settle there. "I want to stay," she said. It was simple. It was complete. It was more honest than anything elaborate she could have constructed, and she had constructed elaborate things before, but this man had shown her over 4 weeks that he received plain truth better than anything dressed up, so she gave him the plain truth. He looked at her with those steady eyes. "Good," he said. Same as he'd said in the kitchen 4 nights ago. Same word, same weight, same quality of a man who has decided something finally and intends to live by it. He crossed the kitchen. He did not take her hand this time. This time, he cupped her face in both of his hands, those large, rough, work-worn hands that had spent 15 years managing everything by themselves, and he looked at her from a distance of 6 inches, and she saw in his face something that was not the careful man she had met on a train platform, not the contained and managing man who had run this ranch alone for 4 years, but something underneath all of that, something younger and more frightened and more real. "I'm not good at this." He said the same thing he'd said before. "I know," she said. "Neither am I." "We'll work it out," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." He kissed her. Not dramatically, carefully, the way a man kisses a woman when he is aware that this is not a small thing and wants her to know he knows it. She stood in the kitchen she had rebuilt and let herself be kissed by this man she had not expected, and she thought, "I came here with 1 suitcase and a speech about not being pretty. Look what I found instead." Morning came bright and cold, the kind of Wyoming autumn morning that makes the air taste like copper and wood smoke, and the specific promise of a season that is serious about itself. They came before 9. The first wagon pulled through the gate at 8:30, and it was Walt Pruitt with his wife and 2 of his ranch hands, and behind him was another wagon, and behind that one another, and by 9 o'clock there were more people in the yard of Carter Ranch than Clara had seen in one place since she left Ohio. She stood in the kitchen and watched them come, and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite joy, but lived in the territory between them, the feeling of a moment that is going to be what it is, regardless of how ready you are. Margaret appeared at her elbow. "You need to be out there," she said. "I need to be in the kitchen," Clara said. "Clara!" Margaret said it firmly, the way she said everything. "The food is managed. Dorothea and Annie know what to do. You need to be out there because these people need to see you." She paused. "They've heard things about you. Some of those things are Hale's version. You need to give them the real one." Clara looked at her. "Go," Margaret said. She went. She walked out of the kitchen and into the yard, and the first person she encountered was a woman she didn't know. A farmer's wife from the east edge of the territory with 3 children beside her, and the kind of face that shows hard winters, honestly. The woman looked at Clara the way people looked at her, the first look, the adjustment, the recalibration. And then something different happened. The woman said, "Are you the one who found the letters?" Clara said, "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked at her for another moment, a different kind of looking this time, and then she said, "My husband's been worried about our water rights for 2 years. Nobody would tell him anything." She paused. "Thank you." Clara felt that move through her like something warm. "You're welcome," she said. Nathaniel was across the yard talking to a group of men she recognized Walt's neighbors, the 2 brothers who ran the sheep operation, and he saw her come out, and something in his posture shifted, settled the same way her own settled when he walked into the kitchen. He excused himself and came to her. "How are you?" he asked low enough for just her. "Ask me in 2 hours," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough." George Hale arrived at 10 o'clock. Nobody had invited him. She saw the wagon pull through the gate and felt the air in the yard change the way air changes before weather, a particular tension, a collective awareness, the human equivalent of animals going quiet before a storm. Hale drove himself same as he'd come to the ranch. He stepped down from the wagon, and he was wearing his good coat, and his expression was composed in the specific way of a man who has decided that the best play left to him is to act as if nothing has happened. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. Nathaniel saw him. Clara watched Nathaniel's jaw set, watched him make the decision not to move toward Hale or away from him, watched him choose the position of a man who stands his ground on his own property. Hale moved through the gathering with the ease of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in any room. He shook hands. He smiled. He spoke to people who had known him for years and who were, Clara could see from across the yard, responding to him with the warmth of habit, not yet knowing what they were going to hear today, not yet understanding that the warmth they felt toward him had been carefully cultivated for exactly this kind of moment. He reached Clara. He stopped. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the front parlor, with the direct assessment of someone who has recategorized her and is working out the implications. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said. "I'm glad you came." Something flickered in his eyes. He hadn't expected that. "Are you?" he said. "I am," she said. "I think it's important that you hear what's going to be said today from the same place everyone else hears it." She met his gaze without flinching. "I think that's only fair." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're a remarkable woman," he said, and she could not tell entirely whether it was a compliment or a concession or both. "I'm a woman who does what needs doing," she said, "same as most." He moved away into the crowd. She let herself breathe. Walt Pruitt stood up on the back of his wagon at 10:30, and the yard went quiet. The way crowds go quiet when someone with the right kind of authority asks for attention. Not loud authority, not the authority of volume or office, but the authority of a man who has been on his land for 3 generations and has therefore earned the right to be heard. "I've been ranching in this territory for 30 years, Walt said. "Some of you have been here longer, some of you are newer, but every one of you has staked something out here, your land, your water, your family's future." He paused. "I need you to know something that some of you don't know yet, about the water rights in this territory and who's been trying to take them." He talked for 15 minutes. He was not a dramatic man, and he did not speak dramatically. He spoke the way he did everything plainly, with weight, letting the facts carry themselves, because the facts were heavy enough to carry the load without embellishment. He held up the documents, the copies of the letters, the land purchase records, the dates on the territorial archive notation, the bank's letter that predated the problem it claimed to have discovered. He didn't interpret them extensively. He let people look at them, pass them hand to hand, read them with their own eyes. Clara watched the crowd. She watched faces move through the same stages. She had watched Walt's face move through Hector's face, Nathaniel's face, the surprise first, then the calculation, then the specific and unmistakable look of people who have understood something that changes their picture of a situation they thought they knew. She watched the people who had just been smiling at George Hale stop smiling. She watched George Hale watch them stop smiling. His composure held. She had to give him that. He stood in the crowd with his good coat and his controlled expression, and his composure held even as the ground shifted under it, because a man who has been doing what he's been doing for 3 years has had a lot of practice not showing what's underneath. Then Edmund Hart spoke. Hart had arrived an hour earlier quietly, with a leather case and the manner of a man who does not need to announce himself because what he carries announces him. He was slight and gray-haired, and had the eyes of someone who had spent 40 years in rooms where people tried to make documents say things they didn't actually say, and had gotten very good at finding the difference. He explained the injunction. He explained what the bribery evidence meant under territorial law. He explained in the careful and precise language of a man who knows that what he is saying will be repeated and needs to be repeatable accurately, what the territorial attorney's office was now investigating. The yard was completely silent. When he finished, a man in the back, a farmer, someone Clara didn't know, a weathered man in his 50s, who had the look of someone who had not spoken in a public gathering for a long time and was spending something to do, it now called out, "What about our water rights, the ones Hale already claimed in his scheme?" Hart said, "The injunction freezes all of them, pending the court review. Every water rights claim filed through Hale's land agent in the last 3 years is under examination. If those claims were filed with fraudulent documentation, they are void." The man nodded slowly, and then he turned and looked at George Hale, and several other people turned and looked at George Hale, and the particular quality of being looked at by people who have just understood what you have done is a quality that no composure can fully absorb. Hale moved. He walked toward Nathaniel, not toward the wagon where Walt and Hart were standing, toward Nathaniel, specifically, The direct line of a man who has decided that his last play is a personal one. Clara moved at the same moment without making a decision to move, without thinking about it, simply responding to what she saw, the way she responded to everything, with the directness of someone whose instincts have been calibrated by a lifetime of paying attention. She reached Nathaniel's side before Hale did. She stood there slightly to Nathaniel's left, and she looked at Hale as he came to them, and she did not step back or step aside. Hale stopped. He looked at them both. He looked at Clara standing beside Nathaniel, standing with him, not behind him, and not in front of him, but beside him, in the way of someone who has decided where she belongs, and intends to be there regardless of what comes. "Carter," Hale said. His voice was still controlled. "You've made your move. I'll make mine." "That's your right," Nathaniel said. "The court process takes time," Hale said. "I have lawyers. I have resources. I can tie this up for years." "You can try," Nathaniel said. Hale looked at him. Then he looked at Clara. "You," he said. "You are the one who turned this." Clara met his eyes. "I found what was there to find," she said. "And I gave it to people who needed to know it. That's all I did." "You're a woman who came here through a marriage agency with one bag," he said. And there was nothing polite left in his voice now. The composure had found its limit. "Nobody. You were nobody." Clara looked at him. She thought about 25 years. She thought about the mirror she had stopped looking into. She thought about the train platform and the speech she had rehearsed. She thought about a kitchen in Ohio and a father who taught her to read books and died and had nothing to leave her. She thought about Eliza saying, "You're worth more than 10." She thought about Thomas working beside her without being asked. She thought about the farmer's wife who had said thank you. "Then you should have paid closer attention to nobody," she said. Something broke in Hale's face. Not dramatically, just a crack in the surface, a fracture line that ran through the composure he'd been holding, and for one brief moment she saw what was underneath it. Not a powerful man, not a strategic man, but a man who had spent so long being underestimated by other people that he had made the foundational mistake of his career, which was to assume that the people who didn't look like power couldn't wield it. He turned and walked away through the crowd. People moved aside to let him pass and did not move back together afterward, the way they had moved together before he came. He walked to his wagon alone. He climbed up. He drove out through the gate, and the gathering closed behind him like water behind a stone, quiet and complete. Nathaniel let out a breath beside her. She heard it, the specific exhale of someone who has been holding something for a very long time. "He's not done," she said quietly. "No," Nathaniel agreed, "but he's done here." And there was something in the way he said here, meaning this yard, this community, these people who had just seen what he had done and had turned to look at him the way the turning had happened, that told her the most important thing about what had just shifted. Hale could fight in courtrooms. He could use his lawyers and his resources and his time the way he'd told Nathaniel he would. But what he could not do, not anymore, was move in secret. Not in this territory. Not with these people who had now passed his letters hand to hand, and read his dates with their own eyes, and would go home tonight and tell their neighbors and their neighbors' neighbors. The machine that had worked because nobody was watching had been seen, and seen things work differently. The gathering went on for 3 more hours. That was the part that surprised Clara most. Not the confrontation, not the documents, not even Hale's departure, but the 3 hours afterward, when the crowd did not dissipate, but settled in, and people ate and talked and introduced themselves to people they had seen in town for years, but never properly met, and children ran between the tables, and someone produced a fiddle from somewhere, and there was at one point in the late afternoon actual dancing. She stood at the edge of it and watched it, and felt something she did not have an immediate word for. Margaret came and stood beside her. "You did this," Margaret said. "People did this," Clara said. "People came because of the food," Margaret said. "And they stayed because of the truth. Both of those things were you." She paused. "Don't argue with me. I'm older than you, and I've been right about most things for 61 years. Clara almost laughed. She did laugh, actually, a real one, the kind that comes up before you can make a decision about it, and Margaret looked at her with something in her eyes that was warm and a little fierce, and entirely without the social calculation that had been in so many faces Clara had looked at over the years. "You're going to be all right here," Margaret said. Not a question. "Yes?" Clara said. "I think I am." Hector appeared with 2 cups of something that turned out to be cider pressed from apples he'd gotten somewhere, and handed one to each of them without saying anything, which was the most Hector kind of thing Hector had ever done, and Clara held the cup and stood between the old rancher's wife and the silver-bearded foreman, and watched the community of Millhaven and its outlying territories eat at tables that she had set, and fill an afternoon with the specific warmth that only happens when people have been reminded, by whatever means, that they are connected to each other. She found Eliza at her elbow at some point in the middle of it. Eliza had honey on her chin, and her hair had come mostly loose from its braid, and she was carrying a half-eaten biscuit with the proprietary air of someone who helped make it and intends to finish it. "People keep saying the food is the best they ever had," Eliza said. "That's kind of them," Clara said. Eliza looked up at her. "I helped," she said. "You did," Clara agreed. "The pies wouldn't have been the same without you." Eliza considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she took Clara's hand, just reached up and took it the way children do when they have decided something is simply the way things are, and stood beside her watching the gathering with the settled, complete posture of someone who is exactly where they belong. Clara held that small hand. She held it carefully, the way you hold something you didn't know you needed until you had it, and she stood in the yard of Carter Ranch with the late afternoon light coming across the field, the way light does in Wyoming, in autumn gold and serious, and without apology, and she let herself be in it. Thomas found them an hour later. He came to stand on Clara's other side mirror to Eliza, though he would have denied it, and he did not take her hand because he was 9 and there were limits. But he stood close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and he said nothing. Just stood there, which told her everything. She was between them. These 2 children of a man she had not expected. This boy who worked without being asked, and this girl who had asked her from the beginning if she was going to make it not so quiet. It's not so quiet now, she thought. Not so quiet at all. Nathaniel found her when the light was going and the last wagons were pulling out, and the yard was the specific, beautiful mess of a place that has held too many people and fed them well. He came to her the way he'd been coming to her for 4 weeks, directly, without ceremony, and he stood beside her and looked at what was left of the gathering. "Walt says 3 of the ranchers whose water rights were threatened want to join the legal challenge," he said. "They're willing to contribute to Hart's fees." "That helps," she said. "It changes things significantly," he said. Hale's play depended on isolating people, on nobody knowing what everybody else was facing. He paused. "That's over." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Hart thinks the territorial attorney will move within the month. The bribery evidence is—" He stopped. "He says it's substantial. Victoria's evidence is substantial." Clara thought about Victoria sitting at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, coming in through the back door, asking, "Can I come in?" "How is she?" Clara said. "I don't know," Nathaniel said. "She left for her aunt's house in Denver 2 days ago, left a note for her father." He paused. "I don't think she's coming back to Millhaven. Not for a long while." Clara nodded slowly. She thought about what it cost a person to do what Victoria had done, not just legally, not just socially, but internally, the particular cost of looking at someone you love, and choosing what is right over what is comfortable. She understood that cost in a different way than most people would. She understood it from the other side, from the side of the person who had always been the inconvenient truth that other people had to decide whether they were willing to see. Victoria had seen it. That mattered. "She's going to be all right," Clara said. Not because she knew it, because she believed it, and sometimes believing is what you can offer when knowing isn't available yet. Nathaniel looked at her. Then he said quietly, "Would you be willing to let me court you properly?" She turned to look at him. He held her gaze with the direct, steady, slightly uncertain look of a man who is doing something unfamiliar and has decided to do it anyway. "I know we started in a particular way," he said. "I know what the arrangement was. I know that I said what I could offer was fair, and you told me what you thought of fair." He paused. "I'd like to do this the right way, if you're willing." Clara looked at this man. She thought, he is asking me, not assuming, not arranging, not offering a practical arrangement or a reasonable situation or any of the other things that had been offered to her as if they were enough. He was asking. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." Something in his face, something that had been held carefully in the center of it behind the steadiness and the competence and the controlled management of a man who had been alone too long, released. He reached out and took her hand. Right there in the yard, with Hector banking the fires of the outdoor cook station nearby, and Danny and two ranch hands stacking tables and the last of the late afternoon light crossing the field. Nathaniel Carter took Clara Whitmore's hand and held it in full view of anyone who happened to be looking. And she let him. And that was the beginning of the real story. Not the arrangement. Not the train platform. Not the practical necessity that had brought her across 2 states with 1 suitcase and a rehearsed speech about being plain. This was the beginning. The weeks that followed had their own difficulty. Hale's lawyers were as capable as he'd promised, and the territorial court process was slow and sometimes maddening. The kind of legal grinding that takes place in rooms far from where the actual consequences live and moves at a pace that has no regard for the human cost of waiting. There were weeks when Nathaniel came to breakfast with the specific tension of someone who has been running numbers in his head since before dawn and hasn't liked what he's found. There were weeks when Clara listened to Hart's letters read aloud at the kitchen table and had to work very hard to keep her own counsel when what she wanted to do was put on her coat and walk to Cheyenne and handle it herself. She did not do that. She did what she had always done. She worked. She kept the household. She kept the books with the precision of someone who knows that margin matters, that the difference between a ranch that makes it and a ranch that doesn't is often $100 here, a renegotiated contract, there a waste caught before it compounds. She renegotiated the Keegan freight contract within 30 days of the gathering alone by letter, and she obtained terms that saved Nathaniel $400 in the first season alone. Keegan, faced with a woman who knew the market rates to the penny and had written them in the margin of his quoted price, capitulated with the specific grace of someone who had been hoping you didn't know what you clearly know. Nathaniel came home to find the new contract on the kitchen table and stood reading it for a long time. "How did you?" he started. "I wrote him a very specific letter," Clara said. "Apparently," he said. He folded it and put it in the strongbox and came back and looked at her with the expression she had come to know, the one that was still weeks in working out the dimensions of her still finding new ones. "Clara," he said. "Don't say it like I've done something extraordinary," she said. "I read a contract and compared it to the market. Anyone could do that." "And yet," he said. "Don't," she said. But she was almost smiling. He was smiling. Really smiling, the one she had worked out of him slowly over weeks, the one that changed his whole face into something younger and more open. She had decided early that making Nathaniel Carter smile was a worthwhile investment of her time, and she had been right. The territorial attorney moved in 6 weeks. The charges against George Hale and 3 land office officials were filed on a Tuesday in November, and the news reached Millhaven by Wednesday morning and reached Carter Ranch by Wednesday noon, when Danny rode back from the post at a speed that told Clara everything before he opened his mouth. She stood on the back step and read the letter from Hart twice. Then she walked inside and sat down at the kitchen table and sat there for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. She thought about the woman who had gotten on a train in Columbus, Ohio, with a speech prepared about not being pretty and a suitcase that had been repaired so many times the original was almost gone. She thought about the 200 miles she had rehearsed that speech, refining it, making it smaller and more preemptive, handing out the wound before it could be dealt to her. She thought about how small that speech seemed now. Not wrong. She understood why she had made it. She understood every year that had built it. but small like a door in a wall. She had been living inside so long, she had forgotten there was anything on the other side. There was a great deal on the other side. Nathaniel came in from the field for the midday meal and found her at the table and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She held up the letter. He took it and read it, and she watched his face go through something that was complex and quiet, the face of a man for whom the end of a long-running fear looks less like relief and more like the specific exhaustion of someone who has been braced for impact for a very long time and can finally stop bracing. He set the letter down. He sat down across from her. They looked at each other. "It's not all the way over," he said. "No," she agreed. "But the worst of it is." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. That evening at supper, Thomas asked if the ranch was safe now, and Nathaniel said yes, "We're going to be all right." And Thomas nodded with the precise gravity of a boy who has needed to hear that for a long time, and is now filing it away in the place where reliable things live. Eliza asked if they could make the honey cake again. Clara said yes. They made it that Sunday, Eliza on her stool, and Clara at the counter, and the kitchen full of the smell of it, that particular sweetness that her grandmother had reserved for the moments worth marking. And Clara thought, yes. This is one of those moments. This is exactly one of those. Victoria wrote from Denver in December. The letter was not long. It said that she was well and that her aunt was kind and that she had found work in a millinery shop, which she had not expected to enjoy and did. It said that she understood if Nathaniel and Clara did not want to hear from her given everything. It said she hoped they were all right. Clara wrote back. Her letter was longer. She told Victoria about the court case progress. She told her about Eliza and Thomas and the honey cake. She told her that the kitchen had been painted in October a warm cream color that made it feel even more like itself, and that the rolls on Sunday had become a tradition that neither child would allow to be skipped. She said, "You did a brave thing. Brave things have a way of opening the world back up. I believe yours will." She said, "You are welcome at this table whenever you find your way back." She meant it entirely. The winter came down on Wyoming with the particular certainty of a season that has been here many times before and knows its own strength. The snow came and the cold came, and the ranch pulled in around itself the way ranches do in winter, all the work moving closer to the house and the barn, all the distances shortened by weather and necessity. Clara had expected to find winter hard in a new place. She found instead that she had been preparing for it all her life, all the years of making do with what was there, of finding warmth in difficult spaces, of being the kind of woman who does not wait to feel at home before she starts building one. She built it. Every morning before the sun was up, she was in the kitchen with the fire going and the coffee on and the sounds of the house beginning to wake around her, and every morning without exception, she felt the specific satisfaction of a woman who knows where she is and why she is there, and has made her peace with both answers. She was here because she had to be once. She was here because she wanted to be now. She was here because she had walked into a cold and empty house with one suitcase and a talent that people had underestimated for 25 years, and she had done what she had always done. She had fed the hunger she found. Not just the hunger for food, the hunger for warmth, for belonging, for the feeling of a table that has room at it for everyone who comes. She had fed a family back to life. She had fed a community back to itself. She had fed a man who had forgotten how to live back to the business of living. And in doing all of that, she had fed herself back to something she had nearly stopped believing, in the belief that she was worth feeding too. That her hunger was real. That she deserved the same warmth she gave. On a morning in February, the snow thick on the ground, and the sky that particular blank white of a Wyoming winter at its depth, Nathaniel came down the stairs and found her at the stove and stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "Coffee's ready." He came and stood beside her at the stove, close the way he stood now without the careful measured distance of a man maintaining a reasonable arrangement, and he looked out the small window above the sink at the snow and the white field and the bare trees along the fence line. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About asking you a question," he said. She looked at him sideways. He looked back at her, steady and direct, the most Nathaniel Carter way there was to look. "I think you know the question," he said. She turned from the stove to face him fully. She thought about the train platform, the one suitcase, the speech she had rehearsed for 200 miles, the preemptive surrender, the "I ain't pretty" said loud and first so that no one else could use it as a weapon. She thought about every year that had built that speech, every door, every face, every room that rearranged itself in disappointment. She thought about how far she was from all of that. She thought about Eliza's hand in hers, Thomas's shoulder almost touching hers, Hector's cider, Margaret's 61 years of being right, Walt Pruitt's 3 generations of land, Victoria's letter from Denver, Edmund Hart's careful gray eyes and the injunction that had stopped a machine. She thought about standing in the front parlor and watching George Hale understand that he had miscalculated. She thought about this man in front of her who had stood on a train platform doing the arithmetic of disappointment and had somewhere between the freight contract and the kitchen table and the hand held in full view of everyone remaining decided that she was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. "Ask it," she said. He took her hand. "Clara Whitmore," he said. "Will you marry me, not as an arrangement, not as a practical matter?" He held her gaze without flinching, and she knew where she had heard that quality of holding before, and she understood now what it cost and what it was worth. "Because I love you. Because this house is yours as much as mine and has been since the day you walked into it. Because my children need you, and I need you, and because I have been alone long enough to know the difference between company and the person you were meant to live beside." He paused. "Because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he said, "and I want everyone in this territory to know you are mine and I am yours." The kitchen was very quiet. The snow fell outside the small window. Clara looked at this man who had asked her, who had never assumed or arranged or offered her something reduced, and called it enough. She thought, "I came here with one suitcase." She thought, "Look what I am leaving with." "Yes," she said. She said it simply, plainly, the way she did everything that mattered, without embellishment, without condition, with the full weight of a woman who has been waiting her whole life to say yes to something real. He pulled her close. She let herself be held. And Clara Whitmore, who had stepped off a train in Wyoming with one repaired suitcase and a whispered speech about not being pretty and a talent that the world had spent 25 years overlooking, stood in a warm kitchen in the deep of a Wyoming winter and was held by a man who had found in her not the absence of beauty, but the presence of something the world had never had a good enough word for. She had walked into a cold house and made it warm. She had walked into a broken family and made it whole. She had walked into a community that didn't see her and made it look and look again and finally see. She had come with nothing the world thought worth having, and she had built everything. The rolls were on the counter, rising slow and steady for Sunday morning. The coffee was hot. The children were asleep upstairs, dreaming the deep and untroubled dreams of children who have learned at last that the house beneath them is solid. And Clara Whitmore Carter, who had always been exactly enough in a world that had simply not been paying close enough attention, was exactly where she was meant to be. And she knew it, and she was never going to let anyone tell her otherwise again.